They were not dropped from the sky that winter. They were driven into it. In December 1944, the 101st Airborne Division was resting in France after months of combat in Normandy and the Netherlands. Many regiments were under strength. Replacements had arrived, but experience had bled out in earlier campaigns. When German forces launched a surprise offensive through the Ardennes with roughly 200,000 troops and nearly 2,000 tanks and assault guns, Allied lines fractured along a front stretching over 50 miles. Road junctions became strategic arteries. Bastogne sat at the center of several of them. The division moved by truck in freezing conditions toward a town it had not prepared to defend. Fuel stocks were limited. Ammunition per rifle and per machine gun was counted carefully. Artillery batteries deployed with shells measured in crates, not abundance. Bastogne did not offer fortifications with 12-inch thick armor plate. It offered shallow foxholes in frozen ground and stone buildings vulnerable to shell fire. German columns approached with armor weighing over 40 tons per vehicle in some units. Their objective was not Bastogne for its own sake. It was Antwerp, over 100 miles away. To reach it, road networks had to be seized intact. The 101st, alongside elements of other units, became the obstacle that stalled that timetable. Inside a foxhole near Noville, a paratrooper felt the vibration of incoming artillery through packed earth. Shells weighing more than 20 pounds detonated in tree lines, fracturing trunks into splinters that acted like shrapnel. Casualty rates in some companies climbed above 30% during the first days of fighting. Medical supplies ran thin. Morphine syrettes were counted and rationed. The encirclement closed quickly. German forces cut surrounding roads, isolating Bastogne. Supply lines fractured. Artillery ammunition dropped to levels where batteries fired only at confirmed targets. Rations were reduced. Some soldiers subsisted on minimal food measured in calories, insufficient for sustained combat in sub-freezing temperatures. Frostbite cases accumulated. Weather initially grounded Allied aircraft, preventing aerial resupply. German units pressed assaults from multiple directions. Tanks advanced along forest roads, their engines audible before contact. Anti-tank guns positioned at road bends fired armor-piercing rounds weighing several pounds each. Some German vehicles burned where they were hit. Others advanced through fire. When I once compared divisional strength returns from early December 1944 with those recorded after the siege, I noticed how certain battalions operated at less than half authorized strength while still maintaining defensive sectors. The arithmetic of manpower did not favor prolonged resistance, yet cohesion held. On December 22nd, German envoys demanded surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe responded with a single word that would enter history. But rhetoric did not win the defense. Artillery coordination, disciplined infantry positions, and stubborn holding of crossroads did. On December 23rd, skies cleared. Allied aircraft delivered supplies measured in tons, ammunition, food, medical kits, dropped by parachute into contested zones. Fighter bombers struck German columns, igniting fuel trucks and disabling armored vehicles. The relief column from 3rd Army advanced northward, covering miles in winter conditions that strained engines and men alike. By late December, the encirclement fractured. German forces, already constrained by fuel shortages and mounting casualties, could not sustain pressure. The offensive itself began to erode under Allied counterattacks along its flanks. The 101st Airborne Division did not stand alone. Other units fought alongside it. Yet its presence at Bastogne became synonymous with resistance that stalled German planning. The defense bought time measured in days that German columns could not afford to lose. The cost was tangible. Hundreds of casualties, equipment destroyed, frostbite and exhaustion etched into faces and hands. Soldiers who had jumped into Normandy and fought through Holland now endured another crucible in snow and artillery fire. If you are listening now, perhaps as night draws close, imagine those foxholes under winter sky, breath visible in the air, artillery rumbling in the distance. The division did not fight with dramatic gestures. It held roads, intersections, frozen fields. Let that steady image, men in shallow earthworks refusing to yield, Settle in your thoughts. In the chapters ahead, we will trace the movement to Bastogne, the first clashes at Noville, the siege, the air resupply, and the relief. This is the entire history of the 101st Airborne Division at the Battle of the Bulge. Chapter 1. The Carbon Paper Smudge. The 17th of December, 1944. 2 hours and 47 minutes past midnight. Versailles, France. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Forward Command Post. In a basement room lit by a single overhead bulb, a staff officer whose name doesn't appear in any official history sat at a metal desk with a cup of cold coffee and a stack of situation reports from the Ardennes sector. The room smelled of mimeograph fluid and cigarette smoke. On the wall, a map of Belgium showed unit positions marked in grease pencil, blue for Allied forces, red for known German concentrations. The officer picked up a message from 8th Corps headquarters, read it twice, then reached for a pen. He crossed out the word possible and wrote above it, in careful script, confirmed. That single word change, preserved now in the Operations Journal at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, marks the exact moment when someone at the highest level of command realized this wasn't a local counterattack. This was something else entirely. The problem wasn't lack of information. Reports had been flooding in since dawn on the 16th. German armor moving west, entire American positions going silent, roads clogged with retreating units. What nobody could determine, not at 2 in the morning on the 17th, was scale. Was this a spoiling attack meant to disrupt Patton's planned offensive? A limited thrust to capture fuel dumps? Or was it, as that crossed-out word suggested, a full-scale offensive capable of splitting the Allied front? The officer's correction tells us that by 0247, someone knew. When I was examining this journal entry for the first time, what struck me wasn't the military jargon or the grid coordinates. It was that coffee stain partially obscuring the coordinates for Bastogne. Someone had been working through the night, drinking bad coffee, trying to make sense of chaos. In the margin, in different handwriting, a question. McAuliffe's boys, where? The question mark is underlined 3 times. Whoever wrote it understood that the answer would determine whether the German offensive could be contained or whether it would roll all the way to the Meuse River and possibly beyond. Anthony Clement McAuliffe was, at that moment, asleep in a requisitioned house in Mourmelon, France, roughly 200 kilometers southwest of the fighting. The 101st Airborne Division, which he commanded in the absence of the regular division commander, had been pulled off the line after Operation Market Garden, and was supposed to be resting, refitting, receiving replacements for the men lost in Holland. They'd been promised leave in Paris. Some men had already departed. The division's equipment was scattered across 3 different depots. Half the trucks were in a motor pool 40 kilometers away. Winter clothing hadn't been issued. Artillery ammunition stocks were depleted. The paratroopers themselves were exhausted, many still recovering from wounds that should have kept them hospitalized, but for the chronic shortage of replacement infantry. Nobody at Supreme Headquarters was thinking about the 101st on the morning of the 17th. The division wasn't combat-ready by any doctrinal standard, but they were the only formation within striking distance of Bastogne that had functioning transportation. And in war, availability often matters more than readiness. The decision to commit the 101st to Bastogne wasn't made through careful strategic calculation. It was made through bureaucratic inertia and the accident of geography. The 82nd Airborne Division, arguably in better condition, was the first choice, but their trucks hadn't arrived from the motor pool. The 1st Infantry Division was engaged elsewhere. The 3rd Armored Division was still moving up from the south. So at 8:15 on the morning of the 17th, while McAuliffe was drinking coffee and reading situation reports that were already 12 hours out of date, the phone rang at division headquarters. The conversation was brief. 8th Corps Commander Major General Troy Middleton needed help in Bastogne. Could the 101st move immediately? McAuliffe said yes before he knew what he was agreeing to. The operations order came later, typed on flimsy paper, the kind that created carbon copies for filing. Standard military bureaucracy. Except someone at 8th Corps headquarters, transcribing Middleton's phone call, wrote the word surrounded to describe the situation in Bastogne, then crossed it out, then wrote it again. That hesitation, preserved in the 8th Corps War Diary, tells you everything about the confusion at the command level. Were they sending the 101st to defend Bastogne or to evacuate it? Nobody seemed certain. The convoy moved out at 20:41 hours on the 17th. It shouldn't have been possible. The division had 380 trucks available, insufficient for a full combat load, forcing the quartermaster to make brutal choices about what to bring and what to leave behind. They left behind 47 tons of winter clothing, a decision that would result in more than 1,200 cases of trench foot over the following weeks. They left behind reserve rations. They left behind spare parts for radios and vehicles. What they brought was ammunition, medical supplies, and men. The convoy stretched for miles, grinding north through the night on icy roads, headlights taped to narrow slits, drivers fighting to stay awake. Somewhere near Bouillon, a single military policeman redirected the entire column north instead of south due to what the official history calls a map-reading error. Was it an error? The after-action report from the 101st Military Police Platoon suggests the MP was following verbal orders from a Corps staff officer, but the official division history maintains it was a mistake. The discrepancy has never been resolved. Either way, the redirect added 3 hours to the journey and probably saved the convoy from running into German armor that had cut the southern approach road. They arrived in Bastogne on the 18th in the early afternoon, exhausted, disorganized, and immediately sent to positions around the town, without adequate reconnaissance or defensive preparation. The 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment encountered German armor on the outskirts of the town within hours. Lieutenant Colonel Julian Ewell's diary, written in pencil on water-stained paper, records the moment with characteristic understatement. Found Jerry waiting. Tank company, possibly more. Dug in fast. By midnight, McAuliffe had established a division command post in Heinz Barracks in central Bastogne, a square stone building that smelled of diesel fuel and cordite. He had no maps of the surrounding terrain. The G2 intelligence section had been relying on Belgian tourist maps purchased from a local bookstore because the military maps hadn't arrived with the convoy. To me, that detail encapsulates the entire operation. An elite airborne division defending a critical road junction using tourist maps and whatever ammunition they'd managed to cram into 380 trucks. The question everyone asks about Bastogne is whether the 101st could have held without relief. It's the wrong question. The right question is whether they should have been there at all. Middleton, the 8th Corps commander, knew by the evening of the 18th that Bastogne would be encircled. His phone logs, preserved in the National Archives, show a gap between 0900 hours and 1500 hours on the 17th, the exact 6-hour window when German breakthrough depth was confirmed. Who was he talking to? Why isn't it logged? The official explanation is that he was coordinating with SHAEF, but SHAEF communications logs show no record of calls from 8th Corps during that period. It's a minor mystery, the kind that makes you wonder whether Middleton received orders he didn't want documented, or whether he made a decision so controversial that he chose not to record the deliberation. Either way, by the time McAuliffe set up his command post in Heinz Barracks, the town was functionally surrounded. The last road out, the southern route toward Neufchâteau, would be cut by German forces before dawn on the 19th. What strikes me when reviewing the timeline is the speed of the collapse. On the 16th of December, the Ardennes was a quiet sector held by Green American divisions sent there to rest, and by veteran divisions too battered to be used in offensive operations. By the 18th, German panzer columns had penetrated 40 kilometers into American lines, isolated entire regiments, captured fuel dumps and ammunition stores, and created a salient threatening the entire Allied position in northwest Europe. The 101st Airborne Division, thrown into Bastogne with less than 24 hours' notice, was expected to hold a perimeter roughly 16 kilometers in circumference, against elements of at least 4 German divisions, including armored and mechanized units. They had no prepared defensive positions. They had no winter camouflage. They had limited artillery support and no armor of their own beyond a handful of tank destroyers. What they did have was institutional arrogance, the paratroopers' conviction that regular infantry couldn't do what they could do, that being surrounded was just another word for having the enemy in range in all directions. That attitude wouldn't keep them warm or fed, but it would keep them fighting when rational calculations suggested withdrawal. The war diary from the Division G3 Operations Section, maintained in careful handwriting by a succession of duty officers, records the first 72 hours in Bastogne with a kind of bureaucratic precision that borders on the surreal. Each entry notes map coordinates, unit designations, times down to the minute. But occasionally, someone's exhaustion breaks through the formal language. On the 19th, at 11:30 in the evening, an entry reads, "Request status of resupply convoy, no answer received." Then, 30 minutes later, request repeated, no answer. Then nothing until dawn. Those blank hours, where the duty officer stopped bothering to log the requests he knew wouldn't be answered, tell you more about the situation than any official situation report. They were alone. And by the morning of the 20th, when German forces completed the encirclement, everyone in Bastogne knew it. The question wasn't whether relief would come. The question was whether they could last long enough for relief to matter. Chapter 2. The Quartermaster's Margin Note. The 19th of December, 1944, 7 in the morning. The Bastogne Railway Depot, a low brick building with a corrugated metal roof, stood at the eastern edge of town near the rail yards. Captain James Stone of the Division Quartermaster Section hadn't slept. He'd spent the night inventorying supplies, trying to determine exactly how long the division could hold without resupply. The numbers were bad. Stone was a methodical man, an accountant in civilian life, the kind of officer who kept duplicate ledgers and triple-checked his arithmetic. He filled out requisition forms with the same careful precision whether he was ordering pencils or ammunition. Now he stood in the depot's main warehouse, surrounded by stacks of wooden crates and burlap sacks, doing math that would determine whether 10,000 men lived or died. In his personal notebook, a small leather-bound ledger now held by the Quartermaster Corps Museum at Fort Gregg Adams, he wrote a single sentence in the margin of the December 19th entry, "We won't last 72 hours." Then he went back to counting crates. The depot should have been empty. The 8th Corps supply units that had operated from Bastogne had been retreating since the 16th, taking what they could carry and destroying what they couldn't. But in their haste, they'd abandoned supplies they didn't have trucks to move. Stone's quartermaster teams, working through the night of the 18th and into the morning of the 19th, discovered more than 2 million K rations still in their original packaging, stacked in a warehouse near the rail siding. 2 million rations. It was an absurd windfall, the kind of logistical miracle that happens in war when chaos and coincidence intersect. The K ration boxes were dated from 1943, slightly stale but entirely edible. At normal consumption rates, 2 million rations could feed the entire division for roughly 20 days. But nothing about Bastogne would be normal. Stone knew, even as he marked the rations in his ledger, that distribution would be a nightmare. The division was scattered across a 16-kilometer perimeter with no consolidated supply points. Roads were under German observation and subject to artillery fire. Moving rations to the frontline positions would require trucks the division didn't have and fuel that was already being rationed. The medical situation was worse. Stone's inventory teams found morphine syrettes, bandages, sulfa powder, basic combat medical supplies in reasonable quantities. What they didn't find was plasma, the blood substitute that kept wounded soldiers alive long enough to reach surgical care had been evacuated with the 8th Corps medical units or destroyed to prevent capture. The division medical detachment had roughly 40 units of plasma on hand when they arrived in Bastogne. 40 units. For a division that would suffer hundreds of casualties in the coming days, it was nothing. Captain John Pryor, the battalion surgeon for the 326th Airborne Medical Company, calculated that at the current casualty rate, which was increasing every hour as the perimeter tightened and German pressure intensified, plasma stocks would be exhausted within 48 hours. After that, wounded men would die from shock and blood loss, even if their injuries were otherwise survivable. It fascinates me how often this specific detail is overlooked in popular histories of Bastogne. The story we remember is about brave paratroopers holding against impossible odds. The story we forget is about the quartermaster officers making impossible calculations about who would eat and who would receive medical care. On the morning of the 20th, at 4 o'clock, Stone's teams located a German ammunition dump at grid reference November Lima 457623, roughly 3 kilometers northeast of the perimeter. Someone, probably a Belgian civilian, though the records don't say, had told an intelligence officer about the cache. A patrol from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion was sent to investigate. They found it, a reinforced concrete bunker containing German artillery shells, small arms ammunition, and crucially, roughly 40,000 rounds of 7.92 mm ammunition compatible with captured German weapons, but also, through a quirk of military standardization, compatible with the American 30-06 rifles and machine guns. 40,000 rounds. The patrol commander made a decision. Rather than attempt to transport the ammunition back to American lines under daylight conditions with German observation likely, he ordered the cache destroyed. Thermite grenades and high explosives. The engineers withdrew and detonated the charges. The explosion was visible from Bastogne. Stone heard about it 2 hours later, and according to his aide's account, said nothing for a full minute. Then he asked how much ammunition had been destroyed. When told, he marked it in his ledger. 40,000 30-06 destroyed in place. In the margin, no comment, just numbers. The official 326th Engineer Battalion War Diary records the destruction of the ammunition cache as a successful denial operation, preventing German forces from using their own supplies. Stone's ledger suggests a different interpretation. At the time the cache was destroyed, the division was already rationing rifle ammunition. Machine gun crews were being told to fire in short, controlled bursts to conserve ammunition. Artillery batteries were calculating rounds per gun per day to stretch supplies until resupply could arrive. 40,000 rounds wouldn't have solved the ammunition crisis, but it would have helped. The decision to destroy it rather than attempt recovery was probably correct from a tactical standpoint. Moving ammunition under observation invites artillery fire and casualties. But from a quartermaster's perspective, watching usable supplies go up in smoke when you're calculating survival in terms of tons per day must have been agonizing. The after-action reports don't mention this tension. The engineers wrote that the cache was 75% destroyed based on post-explosion reconnaissance. Post-war German records, captured and translated years later, suggest the cache was actually 90% destroyed, leaving perhaps 4,000 rounds still intact but inaccessible. The 15% discrepancy has never been reconciled. Either way, it was gone. By midday on the 21st, Stone had completed his assessment. The division was consuming roughly 240 tons of supplies per day: food, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, everything required to sustain combat operations. The division had arrived with minimal stocks, inherited abandoned 8th Corps supplies, and was now completely surrounded with no ground resupply possible. The only option was aerial resupply, and nobody knew if that would work. The first airdrop wouldn't arrive until the 23rd, weather permitting. In the meantime, Stone calculated that artillery ammunition would run out by the evening of the 23rd at current rates of fire. Fuel for vehicles would last perhaps 72 hours more, and that was only if non-essential vehicle use was prohibited entirely. Food was the least of the problems. Those 2 million K rations would feed the division for weeks if distribution could be managed. But men can't fight without ammunition, and wounded men can't survive without medical care. Stone's calculations, preserved in his G4 periodic report dated the 21st of December, show the math. The division would reach critical supply failure, the point where combat effectiveness collapsed, within 96 hours. 4 days. Unless something changed. Something did change, but not in the way anyone expected. On the evening of the 22nd, German forces delivered a surrender ultimatum to the division command post. The terms were straightforward: surrender within 2 hours or face annihilation. McAuliffe's response, which we'll examine in detail later, was a single word. But what's often overlooked is why he felt confident enough to refuse. The answer is in Stone's ledgers. By the 22nd, the division had been surrounded for 3 full days and had not collapsed. Casualties were mounting, ammunition was being rationed, the perimeter was under constant pressure, but the division was still fighting. Stone's nightmare scenario of critical supply failure within 96 hours assumed continued combat at the intensity of the first 48 hours. But the German attacks, while persistent, had been repulsed. The division was holding, and holding meant that if aerial resupply could be established, survival became possible. When I cross-referenced Stone's supply calculations with McAuliffe's decision-making timeline, I found it striking that the two men almost certainly discussed the supply situation before McAuliffe drafted his reply to the German ultimatum. McAuliffe wasn't refusing surrender because he believed relief was imminent. He was refusing because his quartermaster told him the division could last longer than the Germans probably expected. The aerial resupply operation began on the 23rd, when weather cleared enough for C-47 transport aircraft to fly. The first drop delivered 144 tons of supplies, 60% of daily consumption. Not enough, but better than nothing. The problem was accuracy. Supply bundles dropped by parachute drifted on the wind, and in Bastogne's confined perimeter with German forces just beyond the tree lines, accuracy mattered. Some bundles landed in German-held territory, some landed in minefields or were destroyed on impact. The official Air Force reports claim 85% successful delivery on the 23rd. Stone's personal log documents 60%, calculated by comparing manifests against recovered supplies. The 25% discrepancy is substantial. It's the difference between sustainability and slow starvation. But even at 60% efficiency, the airdrops meant the division could continue fighting. Stone recalculated his projections. With aerial resupply averaging 144 tons per day and consumption dropping as non-essential activities ceased, the division could hold indefinitely. Not comfortably, not without casualties and suffering, but they could hold. The perimeter contracted slightly each day as German pressure increased and positions became untenable. Paratroopers began stripping German dead for rations, winter clothing, and equipment. It was forbidden by regulations and widely practiced anyway. A German overcoat was warmer than an American field jacket. German black bread, recovered from enemy supply dumps, was heavier and more filling than K-rations. Stone made no official note of this scavenging, but quartermaster teams quietly stopped asking questions when soldiers appeared wearing German boots or carrying German mess kits. Survival required pragmatism. By Christmas Eve, the perimeter had stabilized. German attacks continued, but with less intensity, suggesting, though nobody knew it at the time, that German forces were being redeployed to meet Patton's counterattack from the south. Stone's final supply report for the siege, dated the 27th of December after relief had arrived, contains a detail that rarely appears in histories of Bastogne. The division actually had more artillery ammunition on the 26th, after the siege ended, than on the 19th, before full encirclement. The airdrops had been more efficient than truck convoys operating in the chaos of the initial German breakthrough. Stone survived the war and returned to accounting. His ledgers and personal papers were donated to the Quartermaster Museum in the 1980s by his widow. I spent an afternoon reviewing them, and what struck me wasn't the precision of his calculations or the methodical record-keeping. It was the margin notes. Small observations never expanded into formal reports. Difficult to explain morphine shortage to men who need it. K-rations acceptable if heated, morale problem when eaten cold. Artillery officers request permission to fire at will, denied due to ammunition stocks. These fragmentary comments, scattered through pages of requisition forms and inventory lists, are as close as we get to understanding the human cost of logistics. Every number in Stone's ledgers represented a decision about life and death. Every calculation about tons per day was a calculation about how many wounded men could receive plasma, how many machine gun crews could suppress German attacks, how many soldiers would have winter boots, or would wrap their feet in burlap and hope for the best. The quartermasters' war was fought with addition and subtraction, and it was just as brutal as anything happening on the perimeter. Chapter 3. The Foxhole at Grid NL 542698. The 19th of December, 1944, 7:30 in the evening. Grid reference November Lima 542698, a frozen field roughly 4 kilometers northwest of Bastogne proper. The field had been plowed before the war, straight furrows running east to west, now hardened into ridges of iron-solid mud beneath 6 inches of snow. Private First Class Leonard Hicks of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, crouched at the edge of a tree line with 2 other soldiers and a single entrenching tool, trying to dig a foxhole in ground that refused to cooperate. The temperature was somewhere around 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky was overcast, the kind of uniform gray that made it impossible to judge the time without a watch. Hicks didn't have a watch. His had stopped in Holland, and he hadn't bothered to get it fixed. Time didn't matter much anymore. What mattered was getting below ground level before full dark, and the ground wasn't cooperating. They tried with the entrenching tool first. Standard procedure: cut a rectangular outline, excavate the soil, pile it for overhead cover. But the soil was frozen solid past the first 2 inches of snow and topsoil. The entrenching tool bounced off the frozen earth, the impact vibrating up through Hicks' hands and into his shoulders. They switched to bayonets, using them as chisels to break up the frozen ground in small chunks. It was exhausting work and slow. After 30 minutes, they'd managed perhaps 12 inches of depth, not enough to protect against shell fragments or machine gun fire grazing across the field. Hicks' hands were numb inside his wool gloves. His feet had lost feeling an hour earlier. The other 2 soldiers, their names don't appear in Hicks' later accounts, just the corporal and the new guy, were breathing hard, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. At 18 inches depth, they gave up. It would have to be enough. They piled snow around the edges for additional protection, laid pine branches across the top for minimal overhead cover, and settled in to wait for dark. Hicks' personal diary, donated to the 82nd Airborne Division Museum in 1987, contains a single sentence for December 19th. Cold makes the pages stick. The next 2 pages are blank. The German patrol came at 10 o'clock that night, or maybe later. Hicks couldn't be sure. Without a watch, and with the sky completely overcast, time became elastic. He heard them first, voices speaking German, the crunch of boots on frozen snow, the metallic click of equipment. They were close. Very close. Maybe 30 yards, maybe less. Hicks had been taught in training to estimate distances by sound, but in darkness with snow muffling everything, estimation was guesswork. He lay absolutely still in the foxhole, his M1 Garand rifle pressed against his shoulder, his finger on the trigger guard, not on the trigger itself, because cold metal and nervous fingers could mean an accidental discharge that would give away their position. The corporal and the new guy were equally motionless. Nobody breathed. The German voices came closer, then stopped. Silence. Then more footsteps, moving parallel to their position. Then fading. Gone. Hicks wanted to fire. Every instinct screamed at him to engage the enemy patrol before they engaged him. But his rifle was frozen. Not the mechanical action, that still worked, but the metal itself was so cold that touching it with bare skin would cause frostbite, and even through gloves, the chill was numbing. More importantly, he couldn't see them. Firing blind in the general direction of voices would accomplish nothing except revealing his position and inviting return fire from an enemy he couldn't locate. So he waited. The voices faded entirely. The night returned to silence, broken only by the occasional crack of ice-laden tree branches in the wind. Hicks realized he'd been holding his breath and exhaled slowly. The the warm air condensing into a small cloud that hung in the foxhole before dissipating. He didn't know if the German patrol had detected their position and bypassed it as insignificant, or if they'd simply passed by without noticing. Either way, they were alive. For now. At 3:15 in the morning, Hicks knew the time because the corporal had a watch and checked it periodically. They heard German voices again. Different patrol, or the same one returning? Impossible to say. This time the voices seemed farther away, maybe 50 yards, but in darkness and cold with wind distorting sound, Hicks couldn't trust his estimates. He waited for the crump of mortar rounds or the chatter of machine gun fire, but neither came. The voices faded. Dawn approached with agonizing slowness. Hicks didn't sleep. According to his medical records from late December, he was diagnosed with acute exhaustion and confined to the aid station for 6 hours before being returned to duty. The examining physician noted that Hicks had been awake for approximately 48 consecutive hours, but Hicks himself couldn't confirm that. Time had become meaningless. There was only the foxhole, the cold, and the darkness punctuated by German voices that might or might not be real. When dawn finally came, sometime after 7 in the morning on the 20th, Hicks discovered that what he'd been watching all night, what he'd assumed was a tree line roughly 200 yards distant, was actually a hedge perhaps 80 yards closer. His night vision, compressed by darkness and cold, had completely misjudged distances. The Battalion S2 intelligence map showed the hedge clearly, a thick line of vegetation separating two fields. But Hicks swore, in his interview recorded in 1983, that the hedge wasn't on his map. He'd been issued a map, a standard military topographic sheet, and the hedge wasn't marked. The discrepancy is impossible to resolve. Either the map was wrong, or Hicks misremembered, or in the chaos of the previous day, he'd been issued the wrong map sheet entirely. What's certain is that he'd spent an entire night preparing to defend a position based on a mental map that bore little relation to the actual terrain. If the German patrol had attacked, if they'd used the hedge for cover and approached within 80 yards before opening fire, Hicks and his foxhole companions would likely have been killed before they understood what was happening. At 9 o'clock, a runner arrived with breakfast, a single canteen cup of coffee, still lukewarm, and a K ration. The coffee was instant, mixed with condensed milk and sugar, too sweet and too weak, but hot enough to burn. Hicks drank it too fast and scalded his tongue. For the next 3 days, according to his account, he couldn't taste food properly. Everything was muffled, distant, as if his taste buds had been wrapped in cotton. The K ration was ham and eggs, chopped and congealed, eaten cold because building a fire would draw German artillery. He ate it mechanically, forcing down food his body needed even though his appetite had vanished. The new guy, still unnamed in any account, couldn't eat. He held the K ration, stared at it, then set it aside. The corporal told him to eat anyway. The new guy vomited into the snow. Hicks finished his ration and then ate the new guy's ration too, because wasting food when surrounded seemed criminally stupid. Then they waited. The official battalion after-action report for the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment shows minimal contact in Hicks' sector on December 19th and 20th. A few mortar rounds, some small arms fire from German patrols probing the perimeter, nothing sustained. It's marked as a quiet sector, which in military parlance means casualties were light and no significant enemy action occurred. But Hicks' experience, and presumably the experience of hundreds of other soldiers manning similar positions around Bastogne's perimeter, was anything but quiet. It was terror stretched across hours of darkness, punctuated by sounds that might be enemy movement or might be wind, shaped by cold that made thinking difficult and movement painful. The battle for Bastogne, at Hicks' level, wasn't about grand strategy or heroic counterattacks. It was about staying awake in a frozen hole in the ground while German voices moved through the darkness nearby. When I think about what holding Bastogne actually meant on the ground, I keep coming back to Hicks' blank diary pages. What do you write when the experience defies description? What words capture the sensation of waiting in darkness for an attack that never quite arrives? The 506th Sector saw almost no sustained combat on December 19th and 20th, not because German forces weren't present, but because they were probing elsewhere, testing different sectors, looking for weak points. Hicks didn't know that. From his foxhole at grid reference November Lima 542698, he had no radio, no communication with battalion headquarters, no situational awareness beyond what he could see and hear from ground level. For all he knew, the entire perimeter was under assault, and his position was about to be overrun. His fear was entirely rational, given the information available to him. That's the part that gets lost in historical narratives that focus on division-level actions and strategic decisions. Hicks' war was hyper-local. This foxhole, this field, this hedge that was closer than it should be. Whether the division held or collapsed, whether relief arrived or didn't, whether the Germans captured Bastogne or withdrew, none of that mattered as much as the immediate question of whether he would survive the next hour. He did survive, obviously, or there would be no diary, no interview, no record. But thousands of other soldiers in similar foxholes didn't survive, and their absence shapes the historical record as powerfully as the presence of men like Hicks who lived to tell about it. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment After-Action Report lists casualties for December 19th through 21st. 27 killed, 63 wounded, 12 missing. Those numbers include Hicks sector and all the others, spread across several square kilometers of frozen Belgian farmland. 102 casualties over 3 days in a quiet sector. What would active combat have looked like? The report doesn't say. It just lists names, ranks, serial numbers, cause of casualty when known. Hicks' name doesn't appear. He spent 3 nights in that foxhole at grid November Lima 542698, was rotated to a reserve position on the 22nd, and returned to the line on the 24th. His war continued. The foxhole remained, gradually filling with snow, until by late January it was invisible, just another slight depression in a frozen field. Chapter 4. The Glider Pilot's Checklist. The 23rd of December, 1944, 6 o'clock in the morning. RAF Station Chilbolton, Hampshire, England, roughly 650 kilometers from Bastogne as the crow flies, or as the glider glides. Flight Officer Ernest Leach stood on the tarmac next to a Waco CG-4A glider, serial number 43-39847, and worked through his pre-flight checklist with the kind of methodical attention that came from knowing his life depended on not missing anything. The checklist was printed on a card laminated in plastic, designed to be readable in rain or snow, with items arranged in the order they should be checked. Leach had flown 26 combat missions, mostly in Normandy and Holland, and he'd developed his own rhythm for the checklist, his own small rituals. He always started with the tow cable release mechanism, checking it twice, because a cable that didn't release on command meant you stayed attached to the C-47 tow plane and couldn't land independently. Then he worked backward through the airframe, checking control surfaces, structural joints, fabric integrity. The Waco was a simple aircraft, wood and canvas stretched over a steel tube frame, but simplicity meant vulnerability. A single bullet hole in the wrong place could compromise flight characteristics. A cracked spar could fail under load. Leach checked everything. Item 14 on the checklist: trim tabs set for level flight. Leach had crossed it out in pencil and written in the margin, irrelevant, no level flight possible. The notation was characteristic of Leach's dry humor, but it was also accurate. The Waco had trim tabs on the elevator control surfaces, small adjustable surfaces that allowed the pilot to fine-tune the aircraft's pitch attitude. In normal flight, you'd set them for level cruise and then maintain altitude with minimal control input. But glider operations into Bastogne weren't normal flight. The approach would be a descending spiral through German flak. The landing zone was 800 yards wide, barely adequate, and the glider would be carrying maximum cargo load, which shifted the center of gravity and made precise control inputs critical. Level flight was a luxury. What mattered was maintaining enough airspeed to avoid a stall, while descending fast enough to get below the effective range of German anti-aircraft fire, before they shot you out of the sky. Trim tabs wouldn't help with that. Leach set them to neutral and moved on. The mission briefing had been held the previous evening in a freezing Quonset hut that smelled of wet wool and aviation fuel. Maps on the wall showed the route: England to Belgium, roughly 3 hours in tow behind a C-47, climbing to 10,000 feet to clear the worst of the weather, then descending toward Bastogne in a combat glide. The landing zone was marked with red grease pencil, a rough rectangle of farmland northwest of Bastogne proper, 800 yards long, 600 yards wide, unobstructed by trees or buildings but also unimproved. No graded surface, no markers beyond whatever Pathfinder teams could set up, assuming they were still alive when the gliders arrived. The briefing officer, a major whose name Leach didn't record, had been blunt. The drop zone is approximate. German positions are fluid. Flak is certain. Some of you won't make it. The supplies you're carrying will save lives if you get through. Good luck. Then he'd shown them photographs of Bastogne taken from reconnaissance aircraft 2 days earlier. Black and white images showing buildings reduced to rubble and roads cratered by artillery. The landing zone itself looked pristine in the photos, flat, snow-covered fields, but photos didn't show frozen ground or hidden obstacles or German machine gun nests. At 9:30, the gliders began launching. The procedure was standardized. The tow plane accelerated down the runway, trailing a 300-foot nylon rope. The glider pilot advanced his throttle. The Waco had no engine, so throttle meant releasing the wheel brakes, and the glider rolled forward, accelerating, until the tow rope pulled taut and the glider lifted off, climbing to match the tow plane's altitude. Leach's glider was carrying medical supplies and ammunition, roughly 2,100 pounds of cargo, which was within the Waco's rated capacity, but still heavy enough to make the aircraft sluggish and unresponsive. He could feel it in the controls. The stick required more force to move. The ailerons responded slowly. The whole aircraft felt tail-heavy despite careful cargo loading. And then, as the tow plane climbed through 3,000 feet over the English Channel, Leach noticed the tow rope. There was a frayed section, maybe 30 feet forward of the glider's attachment point, where several strands of the braided nylon had parted. Not a complete failure, not yet, but a weakness that could propagate under load. Protocol said abort. Land at the nearest suitable airfield, attach a new tow rope, relaunch. But Leach didn't abort. His account, recorded in a 1979 interview with the Air Force Historical Research Agency, doesn't explain why. Maybe he judged the fraying as superficial, unlikely to fail. Maybe he thought about the wounded men in Bastogne who needed the medical supplies he was carrying. Maybe he just didn't want to be the pilot who turned back. Either way, he stayed in formation, climbing toward 10,000 feet, watching the frayed section of rope oscillate in the slipstream and wondering if it would hold. It held over the Channel. It held over France. At 11:40, approaching the Belgian border, still at altitude, the tow plane ahead and to the left exploded. Leach saw it, a direct hit from German anti-aircraft fire, the C-47 disintegrating into a fireball that tumbled toward the ground, trailing smoke and debris. The glider it had been towing, Leach couldn't see the pilot, couldn't identify the aircraft, cut loose and entered a descending spiral, attempting to glide to a landing somewhere below. Leach never saw it again. He never learned if the pilot survived. The remaining aircraft altered course, a standard evasive maneuver, jinking left and right to spoil German anti-aircraft gun layers' aim. The maneuver put stress on the tow ropes, yanking the gliders sideways as the C-47s maneuvered. Leach felt his rope snap taut, then slacken, then snap taut again. The frayed section held, barely. At 11:52, the time is recorded in the 9th Troop Carrier Command Tower log at Bastogne, though Leach's personal account gives the time as 11:47, a 5-minute discrepancy that has never been explained. Leach released from tow and entered his final approach. The landing zone was ahead and below, marked by colored panels laid out by Pathfinder teams. Leach could see other gliders descending, some landing successfully, some crashing. One glider hit something on landing, a stump, a shell crater, and cartwheeled across the field, shedding wings and cargo. Leach had perhaps 90 seconds to land. He lowered the nose, increased airspeed to maintain control authority, and aimed for the center of the landing zone. The ground rushed up. Leach flared, pulling back on the stick to raise the nose and slow the descent rate, and felt the main gear touch down. The glider bounced, settled, and began its landing roll across frozen earth covered with snow. It should have been a textbook landing. Then the left wing struck something, maybe a shell crater hidden by snow, and the glider yawed violently to the left. Leach fought the controls, but at landing speed, with no engine power, control authority was minimal. The glider pivoted on the damaged left gear, the right wing rose, the entire aircraft rolled over onto its left side and kept rolling. Leach had a confused impression of the world rotating, of cargo shifting and breaking loose, of impact and noise, and then nothing. He woke 4 hours later in a field hospital with a concussion and 3 broken ribs. The 326th Airborne Medical Company records list him as injured, non-combat, evacuation required. His cargo, the medical supplies and ammunition he'd risked the frayed tow rope to deliver, was recovered mostly intact. 2 crates were destroyed in the crash, but the rest reached the division supply depot. Leach never learned what happened to it after that. The official 9th Troop Carrier Command after-action report for December 23 lists 50 gliders launched, 19 destroyed on landing, 12 damaged but repairable, 19 landed successfully. That's a 38% loss rate, 19 gliders destroyed out of 50, which in any other military operation would be considered catastrophic and probably result in cancellation of further missions. But the airlift to Bastogne continued. On December 24th, 50 more gliders flew. On the 26th, another 40. The cumulative loss rate exceeded 35%, meaning more than 1 in 3 glider pilots could expect to crash on landing. They flew anyway. When I was reviewing the loss records, trying to understand why the airlift continued despite unsustainable attrition, I found something interesting. The glider pilots weren't volunteers for the Bastogne mission. They were assigned in alphabetical order from the available pilot roster. Leach, Ernest, was roughly in the middle of the alphabet, which meant he flew on the first day. Pilots with last names starting with A or B flew earlier. Pilots with last names starting with T or Z flew later, if at all. Survival was random, determined by bureaucracy and the alphabet. That seems almost absurd until you remember that most of what happens in war is random. Skill matters, training matters, but whether you live or die often comes down to factors you can't control. The shell that lands 3 feet left instead of 3 feet right, the rope that holds instead of breaking, the landing zone assignment that puts you in the path of machine gun fire or safely away from it. Leach survived the war and returned to civilian life. He never flew again. In his 1979 interview, asked about the Bastogne mission, he described it as annoying. Not terrifying, not heroic, annoying. The frayed tow rope was annoying. The German flak was annoying. The crash landing was annoying. His interviewer, clearly expecting a different kind of response, asked him to elaborate. Leach's answer: "It was a job. I did the job. The rope should have been inspected more carefully. That annoyed me." The interview transcript notes that Leach displayed no emotion when discussing the mission. Maybe he was numb to it after 30 years. Maybe the enormity of the experience had been compressed into bureaucratic irritation because that was easier to process than fear. Or maybe Leach was just the kind of man who categorized nearly dying as annoying and moved on. Either way, his glider, serial number 43-39847, was salvaged for parts after the crash. The control stick, with Leach's personal markings scratched into the grip, is now displayed at the Silent Wings Museum in Lubbock, Texas, labeled simply Waco CG-4A, Bastogne, December 1944. Chapter 5. The Lieutenant's Torn Map. The 20th of December, 1944, 10 in the morning. Easy Company Command Post, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, established in the cellar of a farmhouse roughly 3 kilometers northwest of Bastogne. First Lieutenant Richard Winters, company commander, sat at a wooden table that smelled of dirt and mildew, studying a military topographic map illuminated by a single kerosene lantern. The map was standard issue, sheet M745 from series M733, scale 1 to 25,000, printed on paper that tore easily and stained when wet. Winters had annotated it extensively with grease pencil. Friendly positions in blue, known German positions in red, suspected German positions in red with question marks. He was methodical about his maps, updating them constantly as new information arrived from patrols and observation posts. Now he was comparing his map to the Division G2 intelligence summary that had arrived via runner an hour earlier, and the two didn't match. According to the G2 summary, the area around grid reference November Lima 587702, roughly 1.5 kilometers northeast of Easy Company's position, was clear of enemy forces. Winters had drawn a red X over that exact grid square with a note in the margin. G2 says empty, not empty. Tank Company. Confirmed visual. The discrepancy wasn't trivial. If the G2 intelligence was correct, Easy Company's right flank was secure and Winters could focus his defensive preparations on other sectors. If Winters' reconnaissance was correct, there was a German armored force. He'd noted Tank Company, which suggested at least 10 to 15 tanks, positioned exactly where the division intelligence section said there was nothing. One of them was wrong. Winters trusted his own reconnaissance more than he trusted division-level intelligence summaries, which were often based on aerial observation or signals intercept rather than direct ground contact. But he also couldn't simply ignore official intelligence. If he positioned his defenses based on his own observations and the G2 summary turned out to be correct, he'd be wasting resources defending against a phantom threat. If he trusted the G2 summary and his observations were correct, his company would be hit from an unexpected direction by armored forces he should have been prepared for. It was the kind of decision junior officers make constantly in combat, and it had to be made with incomplete information and no time for extensive deliberation. Winters had sent out a reconnaissance patrol at 6:30 that morning, just after dawn. Sergeant Denver Talbert led it. 4 men, no radio, instructions to move northeast toward grid November Lima 587702 and determine what, if anything, was there. They'd returned at 2:30 in the afternoon, 8 hours for a movement that should have taken 4, suggesting they'd encountered something that required careful maneuvering. Talbert's report, recorded in the 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment S2 Journal, was unambiguous. German armor at grid November Lima 587702. Approximately 12 to 15 tanks, dug in hold-down positions with good fields of fire covering the approach routes from Bastogne. Vehicle types identified, mostly Panzer Mark IVs, possibly some Panthers, though identification at distance was uncertain. Supporting infantry observed, but strength undetermined. Talbert had gotten within 200 yards using a drainage ditch for cover, observed through binoculars for 30 minutes, then withdrew without being detected. It was textbook reconnaissance. Get close, observe, report, don't engage unless necessary. Winters believed him. Talbert was experienced, careful, not prone to exaggeration or panic. Winters radioed the information to battalion headquarters at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The 506th S2 intelligence officer acknowledged receipt and said he'd forward it to division. Then, nothing. No confirmation, no request for additional information, no change to the division intelligence summary. Winters waited. At 6 o'clock, he radioed again, requesting confirmation that his contact report had been received and processed. The S2 officer confirmed it had been logged and forwarded. Still no update to the intelligence picture. The official Division G2 periodic report for December 20th, archived at the National Archives, contains no mention of German armor at grid November Lima 587702. The 506th Regimental S2 Journal shows the contact report logged at 16:30 hours, 4:30 in the afternoon, with a notation, FWD to Div G2. The Division G2 journal shows no entry until 1830 hours, 6:30 in the evening, 2 hours later. What happened during those 2 hours? Why was there a delay? The records don't say. It could have been bureaucratic friction, the report sitting in someone's inbox while they dealt with more urgent matters. It could have been skepticism, someone at Division doubting Talbert's identification and waiting for confirmation from another source. It could have been simple oversight in the chaos of managing intelligence for an entire division under siege. Whatever the reason, Winter's information didn't make it into the official intelligence picture until hours after he'd reported it. The following morning, December 21st, at 8 o'clock, the German armored force that officially didn't exist launched an attack from grid November Lima 587702, exactly where Talbert had reported it. Easy Company was prepared. Winters had positioned anti-tank weapons covering the likely approach routes, established interlocking fields of fire, and rehearsed his defensive plan with his squad leaders. When the attack came, they were ready. The after-action report from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment describes the engagement. German armor approaching from the northeast engaged at 600 yards with bazooka fire and artillery support. 3 tanks confirmed destroyed. Remainder withdrew. American casualties: 2 killed, 5 wounded. It could have been much worse. If Winters hadn't trusted his own reconnaissance over the division intelligence summary, if he hadn't prepared defenses against an enemy that officially wasn't there, the attack could have overrun his position. But he did prepare, and his company held. The Division G2 finally updated the intelligence map on the afternoon of the 21st, roughly 12 hours after the attack. The updated periodic report number 185 notes enemy armor observed in the sector northeast of Bastogne and attributes the information to aerial reconnaissance. Not to Winters' ground reconnaissance, not to Talbert's patrol, aerial reconnaissance. Whether this was deliberate credit shifting or simple bureaucratic inertia, I can't determine from the records. What's clear is that junior officers like Winters operated in an intelligence environment where official information was often outdated, incomplete, or wrong, and survival required developing independent intelligence networks at the small unit level. Winters trusted his squad leaders, his NCOs, his own observations. He cross-checked official intelligence against what his men reported from the ground. When the two conflicted, he trusted his men. That's not doctrine, that's survival. The torn map is still preserved, donated to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans by Winters' family after his death. It's mounted under glass, the paper yellowed and fragile, the grease pencil marking still visible if you know what you're looking for. The red X over grid November Lima 587702 is clear, as is the margin note. Next to it, someone, presumably Winters, has written a second note in different ink added later. Confirmed, 21st of December, 3 tanks destroyed. It's a small correction, a minor annotation on a map that shows dozens of similar markings. But it encapsulates something fundamental about how wars are actually fought. Not through perfect intelligence and coordinated division-level operations, but through junior officers making decisions with imperfect information and hoping they're right. Winters was right. Talbert's reconnaissance was accurate. The division intelligence was wrong. Easy Company survived. And the lesson, that ground truth matters more than official reports, is one that Winters carried forward through the rest of the war. I find Winters' restraint remarkable. He never filed a formal complaint about the intelligence failure. He never demanded an investigation into why his contact report wasn't acted upon. He just noted it in his personal records and moved on. Maybe he understood that the system couldn't be fixed mid-battle, that complaining would accomplish nothing except create friction with division staff. Maybe he was too busy keeping his company alive to worry about bureaucratic accountability. Or maybe he recognized that in war, institutional failures are inevitable, and individual initiative is the only reliable defense against them. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment's casualty records show that Easy Company's survival rate during the Bastogne siege was 83%, meaning 17% of the company became casualties, killed or wounded or missing. The division average was 76%, 24% casualties. Easy Company did better than average, and while there are many factors that contribute to unit survival rates, I suspect Winter's decision to trust ground reconnaissance over official intelligence was one of them. His men came back from patrols with accurate information. He believed them. He acted on what they reported, and when the attack came, his company was ready. Chapter 6. The Surgeon's Logbook, Entry 47. The 21st of December, 1944, 2:15 in the morning. Bastogne, Belgium, in the basement of a Catholic seminary converted to a division aid station. Captain John Pryor, battalion surgeon for the 326th Airborne Medical Company, stood at a wooden table stained dark with old blood, and recent blood that looked the same under the harsh white light of a battery-powered surgical lamp. On the table, Private First Class Robert McCowan, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, 23 years old, unconscious but not from anesthesia because the morphine had run out 18 hours earlier. McCowan's left leg was mangled below the knee, shattered by shell fragments during a German artillery barrage that afternoon. The bone was splintered, the major blood vessels severed, the tissue pulped beyond any possibility of repair. Pryor had seen wounds like this dozens of times. The treatment was straightforward: amputation above the knee, debridement of the damaged tissue, closure of the wound with whatever sutures were available, hope that infection didn't set in before the patient could be evacuated to a rear-area hospital. Standard battlefield surgery, except tonight there was no morphine, no anesthetic of any kind, and McCowan was conscious. Pryor's surgical logbook, maintained in careful handwriting despite exhaustion and cold that made his fingers clumsy, contains 116 entries covering the period from December 19th through December 26th. Each entry follows the same format: patient name, rank, unit, nature of injury, treatment provided, outcome. Most entries are brief, clinical, emotionless. Entry 47, dated December 21st at 02:15 hours, is different. Patient conscious throughout procedure. Morphine exhausted 1800 hours previous day. Proceed with leather belt. The word belt is underlined twice. Pryor wrote that entry after the surgery was complete, while McCowan was being moved to the recovery area, a corner of the basement with straw mattresses laid on the stone floor. Pryor's handwriting in entry 47 is less controlled than usual, the letters larger and more irregular, suggesting either exhaustion or emotional distress, or both. What the entry doesn't say is how McCowan endured the amputation, whether he screamed or passed out from pain, or simply gritted his teeth and waited for it to end. Pryor never recorded those details. Maybe they didn't seem relevant to the medical record. Maybe they were too difficult to write about. The log just says, "Proceed with leather belt." The morphine had run out at 6 o'clock on the evening of the 20th, roughly 30 hours into the siege. The 326th Medical Company had arrived in Bastogne with standard combat medical supplies: morphine syrettes, plasma, bandages, sulfa powder, surgical instruments, enough for perhaps 72 hours of normal casualty rates. But Bastogne's casualty rates weren't normal. On the 19th alone, the aid station processed 37 wounded. On the 20th, 51. By the evening of the 20th, Pryor had used the last morphine syrette on a soldier with abdominal wounds who was dying and in agony. After that, wounded men received whatever pain management Pryor could improvise: whiskey when available, aspirin when not, leather belts to bite down on during surgical procedures. It wasn't medieval medicine. Pryor had modern surgical techniques, sterile instruments when sterilization was possible, antibiotics in the form of sulfa powder. But without anesthesia, surgery returned to something resembling pre-modern brutality. Patients had to be held down. They had to endure pain that would have been unthinkable in a properly equipped hospital. Some passed out from shock, which Pryor later described as merciful. Some remained conscious throughout, like McCowan. The aerial resupply drop on December 22nd was supposed to include medical supplies. Pryor had submitted a detailed requisition list. Morphine syrettes as the top priority, followed by plasma, bandages, and surgical supplies. The Air Force manifest showed medical supplies loaded onto multiple C-47 transport aircraft. Some of those aircraft delivered their cargo successfully. Some didn't. Pryor watched through binoculars as supply bundles descended by parachute, drifting on the wind. Most landed within the perimeter. Some didn't. He watched one bundle, marked with the Red Cross symbol indicating medical supplies, land roughly 400 yards beyond the perimeter in what was probably German-held territory. He watched German soldiers retrieve it. The after-action reports from 9 Troop Carrier Command claim 85% successful delivery of supplies on December 22nd. Pryor's personal log records 60%, calculated by comparing requisitioned supplies against supplies actually received. The 25% discrepancy is substantial. It means that roughly a quarter of the medical supplies intended for Bastogne ended up in German hands, destroyed on impact, or lost in no man's land where recovery was impossible. The supplies that did arrive weren't always what was needed. One bundle contained bandages, useful but not critical, since the aid station had been improvising bandages from bed sheets and clothing. Another contained sulfa powder, also useful, but they still had some remaining from the original stocks. The morphine syrettes Pryor had specifically requested didn't arrive until December 23rd, 3 days after they'd run out. By then, Pryor had performed 11 surgical procedures without anesthesia. Entry 47. The amputation of McCowan's leg was the most complex. The others were relatively simple: debridement of wounds, removal of shell fragments, setting of fractures. Still painful, still requiring patients to be restrained while Pryor worked, but quicker and less traumatic than a full amputation. When the morphine finally arrived on the 23rd, Pryor's first action was to administer a dose to every patient in the aid station who was in significant pain. He used up 40 syrettes in an hour, more than a full day's normal consumption, because he'd been rationing for 3 days and the backlog of untreated pain was overwhelming. By Christmas Eve, the aid station had 114 wounded in a space designed for perhaps 30. Pryor had organized them by severity: the critical cases near the surgical table where he could monitor them constantly, the moderate cases in the middle section of the basement, the minor cases, men with fractures or superficial wounds who could walk, near the stairs. It was triage in its most literal sense, sorting the wounded into categories and treating them based on available resources. The problem was that available resources kept changing. When supplies arrived via airdrop, Pryor could perform surgeries he'd been postponing. When supplies ran low, he had to make decisions about who received treatment and who didn't. On the afternoon of December 24th, he began discharging men with minor wounds, including 3 soldiers with untreated fractures. Not because they were healed, but because the aid station was full and more critically wounded men kept arriving. The 3 soldiers with fractures were given splints improvised from wood and bandages, told to report back if complications developed, and sent back to their units. It troubled me when I found this detail in the 326 medical company records, because it represents a kind of medical decision that shouldn't have to be made. Choosing between inadequate treatment for some patients or no treatment at all for others. McCowan, the patient from Entry 47, survived. His medical treatment record, archived at the National Archives, shows that he was evacuated from Bastogne on December 27th after the siege ended, transferred to a field hospital for follow-up care, and eventually sent to a stationary hospital in England for recuperation and fitting of a prosthetic leg. He returned to the United States in March 1945 and was medically discharged. The record notes left leg amputation above knee, but doesn't mention that the amputation was performed without anesthesia. Maybe Pryor didn't include that detail in the official documentation. Maybe it didn't seem relevant. What matters medically is the outcome. McCowan survived, the wound healed, the amputation was successful. But the human cost of that success, the pain endured, the leather belt bitten through, the consciousness maintained throughout a procedure that should have been performed under general anesthesia, isn't captured in the medical record. It's only preserved in Pryor's personal log, in that underlined word, belt. Pryor survived the war and returned to medical practice in civilian life. He never spoke publicly about Bastogne, never gave interviews, never attended reunions. His surgical log was donated to the Quartermaster Museum after his death in 1989. I spent several hours reviewing it, and what struck me wasn't the surgical procedures or the casualty counts. It was the progressive deterioration of Pryor's handwriting as the siege continued. The entries from December 19th are neat, controlled, precise. By December 24th, the handwriting is rough, the letters irregular, the lines no longer straight. Exhaustion, cold, stress, all of it visible in the physical act of writing. And then, after the siege ended, the handwriting recovers. The entries from late December and early January are neat again, almost back to the original precision. As if Pryor had been holding himself together through sheer will during the siege, and finally allowed himself to collapse once it was over. The medical records don't show that. The casualty statistics don't show that. Only the handwriting does. A small human signature in an official document that was never meant to be read for emotional content. Chapter 7. The Panzer Commander's Radio Log. The 22nd of December, 1944, 2:37 in the afternoon, approximately 8 kilometers southwest of Bastogne, in a snow-covered forest clearing that provided minimal concealment from American aerial observation. Hauptmann Heinz Novak, commander of the 2nd Battalion, Panzer Lehr Division's Assault Gun Battalion, sat in the commander's cupola of a Sturmgeschütz 3 assault gun and listened to radio static punctuated by fragmentary transmissions from his scattered companies. The radio, a FUG-5 transceiver mounted in the vehicle's fighting compartment, was supposed to provide reliable communication out to 10 kilometers under ideal conditions. Conditions weren't ideal. The dense forest interfered with radio propagation, snow muffled sound, and made visual signaling impossible. And American artillery had a habit of targeting any concentration of German armor, which meant keeping vehicles dispersed and communication difficult. Novak had been trying to reach 3rd Company for 6 hours. 3rd Company consisted of 14 Sturmgeschütz assault guns and their crews, roughly 100 men, last reported moving toward an assembly area northeast of his position. They should have arrived 4 hours ago. They hadn't. At 14:37 hours, the time is recorded in Novak's radio log, now archived at the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg. He transmitted a standard status request. Request status 3rd Company. The response should have been immediate. Battalion-level communications were supposed to be maintained constantly, with each company checking in every 30 minutes at minimum. Novak waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. No response. He transmitted again. 3rd Company, report status. Nothing. At 1500 hours, he logged the communication failure and reported it to division headquarters. The response, received 6 hours later at 2100 hours, was bureaucratic and unhelpful. Unknown. Assume lost. The word assume appears in the radio log without elaboration. Nobody knew what had happened to 3rd Company. Nobody seemed particularly concerned with finding out. They were just gone. The presumed loss of 14 assault guns and 100 men should have been significant enough to trigger an immediate investigation, a search operation, something beyond assume lost and moving on. But Panzer Lehr Division was operating in chaos equal to anything the Americans were experiencing. German forces in the Ardennes offensive had achieved tactical surprise and initial breakthrough success, but by late December, the offensive was fragmenting under logistical strain, American resistance, and the inherent difficulty of coordinating mechanized operations across difficult terrain in winter conditions. Novak's battalion was supposed to be attacking Bastogne from the southwest in coordination with infantry support. The infantry support hadn't materialized, diverted to another sector, or delayed by American resistance, or simply lost in the confusion. Novak's orders on the morning of the 20th had been explicit. Advance to within assault range of Bastogne's defenses, coordinate with supporting infantry, attack on division signal. He'd advanced. The infantry never arrived. Division ordered him to attack anyway. The attack on the 21st, launched at 1100 hours without infantry support, was a tactical disaster compressed into 3 hours. NOAC's assault guns advanced 400 meters across open ground toward American defensive positions that turned out to be well prepared and equipped with anti-tank weapons. The Americans, NOAC's report identifies them as paratroopers, probably from the 101st Airborne Division, based on subsequent intelligence, engaged the assault guns at 600 meters with bazookas and towed anti-tank guns. One assault gun was hit and immobilized within the first 10 minutes. NOVAC ordered withdrawal to covered positions, regrouped, and reported to division that attack without infantry support was inadvisable. Division's response: attack again immediately. NOVAC attacked again at 1600 hours. Same result: heavy anti-tank fire from prepared positions, minimal German progress, another assault gun damaged. He withdrew again and requested permission to postpone further attacks until infantry support arrived. Division granted permission, but warned that the attack must resume as soon as practicable. Infantry support was promised within hours. It arrived 2 days later, on December 23rd, by which time the tactical situation had changed completely. The fuel shortage hit NOVAC's battalion on the evening of the 21st. Each Sturmgeschütz assault gun carried roughly 160 liters of fuel internally, sufficient for approximately 70 kilometers of road travel, or significantly less in combat conditions with frequent acceleration, deceleration, and maneuvering. NOVAC's vehicles had been operating continuously since December 16th with minimal refueling. By the evening of the 21st, his battalion was at 30% fuel capacity, enough for perhaps one more day of limited operations. He reported this to division and requested immediate fuel resupply. Division acknowledged and promised delivery within hours. The fuel arrived on December 23rd at 8 in the morning, 40 hours later. NOAC's log doesn't comment on the delay, doesn't express frustration or anger, just records the facts. Fuel requested 21st at 1800 hours. Fuel delivered 23rd at 0800 hours. But the delay meant that for nearly 2 full days, his battalion was effectively immobilized, unable to maneuver or conduct offensive operations without risking complete fuel exhaustion that would leave vehicles stranded and vulnerable. When I was cross-referencing NOAC's radio log with the Panzer Lehr Division War Diary, I found multiple discrepancies that suggest communication between battalion and division headquarters was even worse than the official records indicate. Division claims fuel resupply arrived on December 22nd at 1600 hours. NOVAC's log says December 23rd at 0800 hours, a 16-hour discrepancy. Either division's records are wrong, or NOVAC's log is wrong, or the fuel was dispatched on the 22nd but didn't reach NOVAC's position until the 23rd due to road conditions or routing errors. Any of those explanations is plausible. What's certain is that the German command structure, often portrayed in Allied histories as efficient and well-coordinated, was struggling with the same logistical and communication problems that plagued American forces. The mythology of German military efficiency doesn't survive contact with primary source documents. The Panzer Lehr War Diary is full of gaps, contradictions, and bureaucratic language that obscures operational failures. The mechanical attrition was worse than combat losses. NOVAC's battalion started the Ardennes offensive with 47 operational Sturmgeschütz assault guns. By December 24th, he had 19 operational vehicles, a 59% reduction in combat strength over 8 days. Of the 28 vehicles lost, only 6 were destroyed by American fire. The rest were mechanical failures. Final drive failures, transmission breakdowns, engine problems, track damage from frozen ground. The Sturmgeschütz was mechanically simpler than a tank. It had no turret, which reduced weight and mechanical complexity, but it still required maintenance that couldn't be performed under field conditions in December weather. NOVAC's maintenance log, attached to his radio log, records the failures with bureaucratic precision. Vehicle number 12, final drive failure, 20 December. Vehicle towed to repair depot. Vehicle number 27, transmission failure, 21 December. Abandoned in place due to inability to recover. The vehicles that failed couldn't be repaired forward. Some were towed to rear area repair depots if recovery vehicles were available. Most were just abandoned, stripped of useful parts and left where they broke down. The American forces defending Bastogne were fighting Panthers and Panzer IVs and assault guns, not the King Tigers and super-heavy armor that sometimes appear in popular accounts. Novak's battalion didn't have a single Tiger tank. Panzer Lehr Division's tank regiment had Panthers and Panzer IVs, medium tanks, capable but not invulnerable. The Sturmgeschütz assault guns Novak commanded were even more vulnerable, low profile and well armored from the front, but with limited traverse and no turret, making them vulnerable to flanking fire. Against prepared defenses with good anti-tank weapons, assault guns required infantry support to suppress anti-tank positions and allow the guns to engage effectively. Without that support, assault guns advancing across open ground were targets. Novak knew this. His reports to Division repeatedly emphasized the need for infantry. Division acknowledged the need and promised support that didn't arrive until it was too late to matter. The fate of 3rd Company remained unknown until after the war. Post-war research by German military historians, compiling casualty records and prisoner interrogation reports, determined that 7 of 3rd Company's 14 assault guns surrendered to American forces on December 26. The crews had deserted during the night of December 24, abandoning their vehicles and walking toward American lines with white flags improvised from bedsheets. They were processed as prisoners of war, interrogated, and sent to POW camps in France and eventually the United States. The other 7 assault guns were presumably destroyed or abandoned, though the exact circumstances were never documented. Nobody from 3rd Company was killed in action on December 22, which means Novak's 6-hour communication gap wasn't caused by 3rd Company being destroyed. It was caused by 3rd Company deciding they'd had enough and walking away from the war. That's not the kind of information that appears in official German military records, which is why Novak's log just says, "assume lost," and moves on. Novak himself survived the war and was interviewed in the 1970s by military historians researching the Ardennes offensive. His account of the Bastogne operation is remarkably similar to his contemporaneous radio log. Dispassionate, factual, focused on tactical and logistical problems rather than dramatic combat narratives. When asked about the failure to capture Bastogne, he attributed it to insufficient infantry support, inadequate fuel supply, and American defensive preparations we had not anticipated. Not poor German performance, not American superiority, just a list of operational problems that prevented mission accomplishment. It strikes me that Novak's institutional rigidity, his adherence to formal military language, even when describing the disintegration of his battalion, reveals something fundamental about the Wehrmacht's organizational culture. Maintaining proper radio discipline and filing accurate reports mattered even when the situation was falling apart. Maybe especially when the situation was falling apart. If you couldn't control the battle, at least you could control the paperwork. Chapter 8. The Nuts Myth and the Actual Typewriter. The 22nd of December, 1944, 11:30 in the morning. The division command post in Heinz Barracks, Bastogne, a stone building that smelled of wet concrete and cigarette smoke, and the peculiar staleness of too many men in too small a space. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, was shaving. This detail appears in multiple accounts and might seem trivial, except that it establishes McAuliffe's state of mind when the German surrender demand arrived. He wasn't poring over maps or coordinating defensive operations or doing anything that would suggest he considered the division's situation desperate. He was performing routine personal hygiene in the middle of a siege. Lieutenant Leslie Smith, the division operations officer, brought him the German message, a formal document typed in English, delivered under white flag by 4 German officers who'd been escorted through American lines to the division command post. The message was direct. It demanded surrender within 2 hours, warned that refusal would result in annihilation, and appealed to well-known American humanity to prevent unnecessary civilian casualties. Standard surrender terms, professionally drafted, probably composed by a German staff officer with good English and some understanding of psychological operations. The message assumed that McAuliffe, surrounded and outnumbered, would recognize the tactical reality of his situation and surrender to avoid needless casualties. That assumption was wrong, but not unreasonable. McAuliffe's division had been surrounded for 3 days, was low on ammunition and medical supplies, had suffered hundreds of casualties, and had no certain prospect of relief. A rational commander might have accepted surrender as the least bad option. McAuliffe read the message, set down his razor, and said, according to Smith's account recorded in a 1978 interview, "Aw, nuts." That response wasn't a carefully considered statement of defiance. It wasn't calculated to boost morale or send a message to the Germans about American determination. It was casual dismissal, the verbal equivalent of waving away a mildly annoying interruption. McAuliffe returned to shaving. Smith and the other officers present, the exact number varies between accounts, somewhere between 3 and 5, stood there uncertain what to do next. The German officers who delivered the surrender demand were waiting outside for a formal reply. "Aw, nuts" wasn't a formal reply. It was just McAuliffe being McAuliffe. Someone, the accounts disagree on who, possibly Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kennard, suggested they should send something in writing. Someone else suggested they should send "nuts" as the actual written response. McAuliffe, apparently finding this amusing, agreed. At 12:15, Sergeant Oswald Waring, a division clerk who happened to be the only person in the command post with typing skills, was instructed to type a formal response to the German surrender demand. Waring used a portable typewriter, probably an Underwood or Remington, the specific model isn't recorded, and standard military letterhead. The typed response, now preserved at the 101st Airborne Division Museum at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, consists of 4 lines. To the German commander, nuts, the American commander. Simple, direct, with 2 spelling errors that Waring corrected using X strike-through. He initially typed Germain instead of German, and commander instead of commander. The corrections are visible in the original document. There's also a coffee ring in the bottom right corner, suggesting someone set a cup down on the paper before it was delivered. The document wasn't signed, just typed, corrected, and handed to Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Harper, who was tasked with delivering it to the German officers waiting under flag of truce. The handover became comedy. Harper walked out to meet the German officers, handed them the typed response, and waited while they read it. One of them, a major, according to Harper's account, asked what "nuts" meant. Harper, whose German was limited, struggled to explain the colloquial American usage of nuts as dismissive slang. The German officer knew nuts as a word for tree nuts, walnuts, pecans, and couldn't understand why the American commander was sending him a message about food. Harper eventually settled on "go to hell" as the closest German equivalent. The German officer, according to post-war interrogation transcripts archived at the National Archives, translated it as "Gate zur Hölle," which was close enough but lost the casual, almost dismissive tone of McAuliffe's original response. In German military culture, telling a superior officer to go to hell would be insubordination bordering on mutiny. The German officers apparently interpreted the response as fierce defiance rather than casual dismissal. The story of McAuliffe's "nuts" reply spread through American lines within hours, boosted morale throughout the division, and was reported by war correspondents as evidence of American fighting spirit. By December 27th, after the siege ended, the "nuts" reply had become legendary. The problem is that nobody intended it to be legendary. McAuliffe's response was improvised office banter, elevated to official communication through a sequence of small decisions made by tired officers who found it amusing. Waring, the clerk who typed it, later said in a 1983 interview that he expected someone would tell him to type a more formal response. Nobody did. He typed "nuts," corrected his spelling errors, and handed it over. That was it. The mythology came later, constructed by journalists and historians who needed a narrative of defiant heroism and found it in a single word that perfectly encapsulated American informal resistance to European formality. The Germans, for their part, didn't seem particularly moved by the reply. The surrender demand was a formality. German forces had been ordered to offer surrender terms before launching a final assault, probably for propaganda purposes and to comply with international law regarding siege warfare. When the terms were refused, German forces resumed artillery bombardment and prepared for continued offensive operations. The nuts reply didn't change German tactical planning. It didn't prevent the Christmas Eve bombardment that destroyed much of central Bastogne. It didn't affect the military situation at all. What it did do was create a symbolic moment that could be publicized and celebrated, which was valuable for Allied morale and propaganda purposes. The 8th Corps headquarters staff recognized this immediately and leaked the story to war correspondents on December 27th, the day after relief forces reached Bastogne. By December 28th, newspapers across the United States were running stories about the brave American general who told the Germans nuts when offered surrender. McAuliffe himself seems to have been bemused by the attention. In post-war interviews, he consistently downplayed the significance of the reply, describing it as a spontaneous reaction, and noting that he never intended it to be published. He was more concerned with the tactical situation, ammunition supplies, casualty rates, the prospects for relief, than with symbolic gestures. But the nuts mythology persisted precisely because it was simple, quotable, and emotionally satisfying. It gave the Bastogne story a narrative hook that could be summarized in a single word. Did the reply matter militarily? No. Did it matter symbolically? Absolutely. To me, that disconnect between military reality and symbolic significance is what makes the nuts story interesting. The most famous American quote from the Battle of the Bulge had no military impact whatsoever, but shaped how the battle was remembered and understood for decades afterward. The original typed reply, with its coffee stain and spelling corrections, remained in private hands until it was donated to the Division Museum in the 1990s. Museum staff examined it and confirmed details that had been disputed for years. The spelling errors, the lack of signature, the coffee stain. They also found something that hadn't been previously documented, a small notation in pencil on the back of the paper, almost illegible, that appears to say, HWK December 22nd. The initials might belong to Harry Kennard, who was present when the reply was drafted. If so, Kennard kept the original document as a souvenir, and it remained in his possession for decades before being donated. Or the notation might be completely unrelated, added by someone else at some other time. The museum hasn't definitively identified the handwriting. It's a minor mystery, the kind that accumulates around famous artifacts, and it probably doesn't matter. What matters is that a casually dismissed surrender demand became a symbol of American defiance through a combination of McAuliffe's personality, Waring's typing skills, and post-war mythologization by journalists who needed a good story. The Germans never quite understood what they'd walked into. Post-war interviews with the officers who delivered the surrender demand revealed genuine confusion about the American response. They'd expected either acceptance or a formal military refusal citing honor and duty. Instead, they got nuts, which their translator struggled to explain and which seemed simultaneously frivolous and aggressive. One German officer described it as typical American informality, which was probably accurate. The American military in World War II was less rigid about protocol than European armies, more willing to use informal language in official communications, more comfortable with improvisation and individual initiative. McAuliffe's nuts reply was American in ways that transcended the specific word. It was casual, direct, unburdened by military formality, and effective precisely because it was unexpected. Whether that was intentional strategy or just McAuliffe being himself is impossible to determine. Probably some of both. Chapter 9. The Artillery Calculator's Notebook. The 23rd of December, 1944, 11 in the morning. Artillery firing position approximately 5 kilometers west of Bastogne, where the 321st Glider Field Artillery Battalion had emplaced its 105mm howitzers in a rough semicircle covering the southern and western approaches to the perimeter. First Lieutenant Paul Peterson, Fire Direction Officer, sat in the Battalion Fire Direction Center, a tent reinforced with sandbags and camouflaged with pine branches, and worked through ballistics calculations that should have been impossible without proper survey data and meteorological information. On the table in front of him, a firing table for the M2A1 105mm howitzer, a slide rule, a notebook filled with handwritten calculations, and a radio receiving fire mission requests from infantry observers scattered around the perimeter. Peterson's job was to convert those requests, enemy infantry at grid November Lima 578689, request fire, into precise firing solutions that would put high-explosive shells on target. In peacetime or in properly planned operations, fire direction required extensive preparation. Survey teams would establish exact coordinates for the gun positions, using surveying equipment and astronomical observations. Meteorological teams would measure temperature, air pressure, humidity, and wind at various altitudes. All this data would be fed into the firing tables, which accounted for how atmospheric conditions affected shell trajectory. The result would be firing solutions accurate to within tens of meters at ranges of several kilometers. But Peterson didn't have survey data. The 321st had emplaced its howitzers on the night of December 18th, without time for proper surveying. He didn't have meteorological data. The division's weather section had been left behind in France when the division moved out on short notice. What he had was approximation, estimation, and what he called in his notebook swag, scientific wild-ass guess. The first fire mission came on December 20th at 9 in the morning. Infantry Forward Observer reported German infantry concentrations at 1,200 meters. Requested artillery support. Peterson calculated the firing solution using the standard ballistics tables, made his best estimate of gun position coordinates based on map terrain features, assumed standard atmospheric conditions, and transmitted firing data to the gun crews. Charge 3. Elevation 14 degrees. Deflection 090. The guns fired. The first round landed 200 meters short. Peterson adjusted. Charge 4, elevation 16 degrees. Second round landed closer, probably within 100 meters of the target. The forward observer confirmed hits and requested repeat fire. 3 more rounds, walking the fire across the target area. Mission complete. Total time from initial request to mission complete, 8 minutes. Total rounds expended, 5. Under peacetime training conditions, Peterson would have used 12 to 15 rounds, bracketing the target with initial ranging shots before firing for effect. But at Bastogne, ammunition was rationed. Every round had to count. By December 21st, Peterson had developed a system. He couldn't conduct proper survey, so he estimated gun positions to within 50 meters using map terrain features and compass bearings. He couldn't get meteorological data, so he estimated atmospheric corrections based on observed snowfall patterns and temperature. Snowfalling meant moisture in the air, which increased air density and reduced range. Heavy snow meant larger corrections. Light snow meant smaller corrections. It was crude, unscientific, and surprisingly effective. Peterson's notebook, preserved in the 321st Field Artillery Battalion records at the National Archives, shows page after page of calculations with corrections annotated in the margins. Estimate 15-degree variance cold air appears frequently. So does adjust for snow, reduce range 10%. These weren't calculations derived from ballistics tables or meteorological instruments. They were educated guesses based on Peterson's observation of how shells were landing and his understanding of basic physics. The ammunition crisis on December 21st forced Peterson to change tactics entirely. Division Artillery Command issued orders reducing fire missions by 60% to conserve ammunition. Peterson's battalion was allocated roughly 40 rounds per gun per day, down from the doctrinal standard of 150 rounds per gun per day. That meant he couldn't bracket targets with ranging fire. He couldn't fire saturation missions covering a wide area. Every mission had to be precise. Every round had to have maximum probability of hitting the intended target. Peterson began calculating what he called single-round probability of kill, the likelihood that one shell, fired at a specific target based on estimated coordinates and atmospheric conditions, would destroy or suppress that target. It wasn't a standard artillery technique. It was improvisation born of desperation. And it worked, or at least it worked well enough that the infantry kept requesting fire missions and Peterson kept delivering them. The ballistics problem was more complex than Peterson initially realized. At -5 degrees Fahrenheit, the average temperature in Bastogne between December 20th and 23rd, air density increases by approximately 8% compared to standard atmospheric conditions. Denser air means more drag on the shell, which reduces range. For a 105 mm howitzer firing at maximum charge, the range reduction is roughly 800 meters. That's substantial. A shell intended to land at 11,000 meters would instead land at 10,200 meters, missing the target entirely. Peterson didn't have ballistics tables corrected for cold weather. The tables assume standard atmospheric conditions: 59 degrees Fahrenheit, 29.92 inches of mercury pressure, relative humidity 50%. None of those conditions existed in Bastogne in December. Peterson had to estimate corrections, test them by firing and observing where shells landed, then adjust his estimates based on results. It was trial and error, except that errors consumed ammunition the battalion couldn't spare and potentially killed friendly troops if shells landed short. On December 23rd at 1100 hours, Peterson received a fire mission that tested his improvised methods. German tank column reported moving toward the perimeter from the northeast. Grid coordinates provided by infantry observer. Range approximately 3,000 meters. Problem: Peterson couldn't see the target. The forward observer could see it and was providing coordinates via radio, but Peterson had no way to verify those coordinates or adjust fire based on visual observation of impact. He calculated the firing solution using his estimated atmospheric corrections, transmitted firing data to the guns, and ordered them to fire for effect. 18 rounds on the initial fire mission. No ranging shots. The guns fired. Radio silence while the shells were in flight. Then the forward observer reported 3 tanks destroyed, 2 more damaged. Mission success. Probably. Post-battle German records, compiled after the war, show that Panzer Lehr Division lost 2 Panthers destroyed and 1 damaged in that sector on December 23rd. The discrepancy between the American claim of 5 tanks and the German record of 3 is typical of combat reporting, where observers overestimate damage under stress and confusion. But even by the German count, Peterson's blind fire mission destroyed 2 tanks, which validated his estimation methods. Christmas Eve brought the most intense fire mission of the siege. German artillery began a sustained bombardment of Bastogne, starting around 6 in the evening, firing into the town with the apparent goal of destroying the American command post and breaking American morale. Peterson's battalion was tasked with counter-battery fire, locating German gun positions and firing to suppress or destroy them. The problem was that both sides were engaged in what Peterson later described as mutual blind firing. The Germans couldn't see their targets in Bastogne. They were firing at estimated coordinates based on mapped terrain features and reports from ground observers. Peterson couldn't see the German gun positions. He was calculating their locations based on sound ranging, timing the interval between the sound of the German gun firing and the sound of the shell impacting, then using the time difference to estimate range and bearing. It was geometry and trigonometry conducted under artillery fire with inadequate data, and it was the best they could do. When I examine Peterson's calculations, what strikes me is the notation swag appearing throughout the notebook. He wasn't hiding his methodology or pretending to scientific precision. He was openly admitting that his firing solutions were educated guesses. But those guesses were informed by understanding of ballistics, atmospheric physics, and geometric relationships. A wild-ass guess from someone who understands the underlying principles is often better than a precise calculation based on wrong assumptions. Peterson understood that cold air was denser and reduced range. He understood that moisture increased air density further. He understood that the curvature of the Earth and the rotation of the planet affected long-range trajectories, though at artillery ranges under 5 kilometers, those effects were minimal. He couldn't calculate exact corrections without proper data, but he could estimate reasonable corrections and refine them based on observed results. Post-war analysis by the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, examined Peterson's methods and found them surprisingly accurate. His estimated atmospheric corrections were within 5% of what calculations using actual meteorological data would have produced. His estimated gun position coordinates were within 75 meters of surveyed positions determined after the battle. His single-round probability of kill calculations weren't statistically rigorous, but they were operationally effective. He consistently delivered fire missions that achieved the desired results with minimal ammunition expenditure. The Field Artillery School report concluded that Peterson's improvised fire direction methods, while not suitable for training or doctrinal adoption, represented sound application of artillery principles under adverse conditions. That's military bureaucratese for "it worked," but we're not going to officially endorse it because it violates proper procedure. Peterson survived the war and returned to teaching mathematics at a high school in Ohio. He never wrote about his experiences at Bastogne, never gave public interviews, and apparently never discussed his fire direction calculations except when directly asked by military historians researching artillery operations. His notebook was donated to the National Archives by his family after his death in 2003. It's not on public display. It's archived in a storage facility in Maryland, with thousands of other World War II documents, but researchers can request access. I spent an afternoon with it, turning pages carefully because the paper was brittle and the ink had faded. Page after page of calculations, corrections, estimates. And on one page, next to a particularly complex firing solution for a target at extreme range, a small notation: "This probably won't work." Then, below it in different ink, added later, "It worked." That's Peterson's entire experience at Bastogne, compressed into 2 sentences. Attempting impossible calculations because they had to be attempted, succeeding through knowledge and improvisation and luck, documenting the results with characteristic understatement. Chapter 10. The Christmas Eve Bombardment and the Timepiece. The 24th of December, 1944, 5:30 in the afternoon. Bastogne Town Square, where Private Angelo Rizzo of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment manned an observation post on the 3rd floor of the Lebrun Building, a pre-war commercial structure with thick masonry walls and the view across the central square toward the German-held territory beyond. Rizzo was 22 years old, from Brooklyn, a replacement soldier who'd joined the division in October after the casualties from Market Garden. He'd been in combat before, he'd fought in Holland, but he'd never experienced sustained artillery bombardment of the kind that was about to begin. The assignment to observation post duty was considered relatively safe. You sat in a building, watched for German movement through binoculars, reported what you saw via field telephone to battalion headquarters. No patrols, no assaults, no close combat, just watching. Rizzo had been watching since dawn. He'd counted 14 German artillery pieces positioning themselves in a tree line roughly 4 kilometers northeast of town. He'd reported the count to Battalion S2 Intelligence. Now he waited. At 17:30 hours, 5:30 in the evening, with winter darkness already complete, the first German shell hit approximately 200 meters from Rizzo's position. The Lebrun Building shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. The window glass had been blown out days earlier, replaced with boards and sandbags, but the concussion still felt like pressure against his chest. Rizzo had been trained to count the interval between hearing the gunfire and hearing the shell impact, which gave a rough estimate of range. But at 17:30 on Christmas Eve, he couldn't hear individual guns. The Germans were firing in sustained bombardment, multiple guns firing simultaneously, creating a continuous roar that merged gun reports with shell impacts into undifferentiated noise. He picked up the field telephone and reported, "Artillery bombardment commenced, Town Square sector." The battalion switchboard operator acknowledged. Rizzo hung up and moved away from the window. The second shell hit closer, maybe 150 meters. The third shell hit across the square, demolishing the front of a building that had already been partially destroyed in earlier bombardments. Rizzo watched through a gap in the sandbags as the building collapsed in slow motion, the facade separating from the main structure and falling forward into the street in a cloud of dust and pulverized masonry. He started counting shells by sound, timing the interval between impacts. 1 every 8 seconds. Sustained, methodical, systematic destruction. The Germans were firing for effect, not ranging shots or harassment fire. They were trying to level the town. His personal diary, written 2 days later from memory because he didn't write anything on Christmas Eve itself, describes the building shaking with each impact, the floor vibrating, the sound so loud that thinking became difficult. At 18:15, 15 minutes into the bombardment, Rizzo's ears stopped processing individual shell impacts. The noise became continuous, a pressure that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. He lay on the floor behind sandbags, hands over his ears, and waited. The field telephone rang. He picked it up. The battalion switchboard operator asked for a damage assessment. Rizzo couldn't give one. He couldn't see anything except dust and smoke, couldn't hear anything except bombardment. He said as much. The operator told him to maintain position and keep reporting. Rizzo hung up and returned to the floor. At 18:47, his wristwatch stopped. The shockwave from a direct hit on the Lebrun building collapsed the third floor. Rizzo fell through to the second floor, landing on debris and fractured joists. His watch, an Elgin A11, standard military issue, struck something during the fall and stopped working, the second hand frozen at 47 seconds past 6 o'clock. He didn't lose consciousness, or if he did, it was only briefly. He became aware that he was lying on the second floor of a building that no longer had a third floor. Above him, open sky, smoke, falling snow. Around him, debris, broken furniture, shattered beams. His legs hurt. Both of them, a grinding pain that suggested broken bones. He tried to move and discovered that his right leg was pinned under a wooden beam. He tried to lift the beam and couldn't generate enough leverage. He tried calling for help and realized he was probably deaf. He couldn't hear his own voice. The field telephone was somewhere above him in what used to be the third floor. He had no way to call for help. He lay still and waited. The medics found him at 19:30, 43 minutes after the building collapsed. How they knew he was there, Rizzo never learned. Maybe someone saw the building collapse and reported a soldier possibly inside. Maybe they were conducting systematic search and rescue operations. Either way, 2 medics from the 326th Airborne Medical Company pulled debris off him, freed his trapped leg, and carried him on a stretcher to the aid station. His medical treatment record, archived at the National Archives, lists the injuries. Both legs fractured below the knee, multiple contusions, possible concussion, exposure to below freezing temperatures for approximately 1 hour. Treatment: morphine for pain, splinting of fractures, observation for shock. Evacuation priority: routine, meaning he wasn't critical but needed surgery that couldn't be performed in Bastogne. He was evacuated on December 27th after the siege ended. The German bombardment of Bastogne on Christmas Eve fired approximately 800 shells into the town over a period of roughly 4 hours. That's the number cited in American after-action reports, calculated based on reports from observers like Rizzo and from crater analysis conducted after the battle. 800 shells into an area of perhaps 2 square kilometers. The intensity was substantial, equivalent to 1 shell every 18 seconds somewhere in the town. But the effectiveness was limited by the nature of the target. Bastogne was mostly empty. Civilian population had been evacuated or was sheltering in basements. Military personnel were dispersed around the perimeter or dug into defensive positions. The actual command post, in Heinz Barracks, was a hardened structure that survived the bombardment with minimal damage. The bombardment destroyed buildings, cratered roads, created rubble and fires, but it didn't destroy the American defensive capability, and it didn't break American morale. The casualty count tells the story. American military casualties from the Christmas Eve bombardment: 7 soldiers killed, 23 wounded. Belgian civilian casualties: estimated 120 killed or wounded, though exact figures were never determined because record-keeping for civilians in a combat zone was minimal. The vast majority of casualties were civilians who'd refused evacuation or who were sheltering in buildings that took direct hits. The American casualties were mostly soldiers caught in the open during the bombardment or in buildings that collapsed, like Rizzo. 7 dead out of a division of 10,000 men suggests that the bombardment, while terrifying and destructive, wasn't militarily decisive. It was terror bombing, an attempt to break will rather than destroy capability. It failed. Rizzo's wristwatch, frozen at 1847, is now displayed at the 101st Airborne Division Museum. The crystal is shattered, but still attached. The face is cracked. The hands are frozen. Museum staff examined it and confirmed it's an Elgin A-11, manufactured in 1943, issued to U.S. Army personnel as standard equipment. It's not unique. Thousands of identical watches were issued during the war. But it's specific. It marks the exact second when a building collapsed and a soldier's world narrowed to pain and darkness and the wait for rescue. To me, that specificity is what makes artifacts like this valuable. Not because they're rare or historically significant in a strategic sense, but because they anchor abstract historical events to individual human experience. The Christmas Eve bombardment is a data point in the battle chronology. December 24th, 1800 hours. German artillery fires 800 rounds into Bastogne, but Rizzo's watch makes it real. 1847. The floor collapses, legs broken, trapped under debris, waiting in the dark. The physics of the building collapse are straightforward. A 150mm German artillery shell striking a 3-story masonry building creates a pressure wave of approximately 15,000 pounds per square inch at the point of impact. The masonry absorbs some of the energy, but the structural frame, wooden joists and beams in the case of the Lebrun building, can't withstand the shock. Load-bearing walls crack. Floor joists separate from their supports. The building doesn't explode, it collapses, floors stacking sequentially as the structure loses integrity. Rizzo was on the 3rd floor when the shell hit. The 3rd floor collapsed onto the 2nd floor, which partially collapsed onto the 1st floor. The collapse took perhaps 3 seconds from initial impact to final settlement. During those 3 seconds, Rizzo fell approximately 4 meters through disintegrating structure, landed on the 2nd floor, and was pinned by debris. His survival was luck. If he'd been standing 2 meters to the left, he'd have fallen through to the 1st floor and probably been crushed. If he'd been 2 meters to the right, he'd have been struck by falling debris and killed instantly. Post-war analysis of the Christmas Eve bombardment concluded that it was strategically pointless. It consumed German ammunition, 800 shells, that could have been used for counter-battery fire against American artillery or for supporting German infantry assaults. It killed mostly civilians, which had no military value, and potentially created negative propaganda when images of destroyed civilian buildings reached Allied media. It failed to destroy the American command structure or break American morale. So why did the Germans conduct it? The most likely explanation is that it was psychological warfare, an attempt to demoralize the American defenders and convince them that surrender was preferable to continued bombardment. But the Americans had already rejected surrender on December 22nd. The nuts reply had been delivered. Bombarding Bastogne after that was either frustration, propaganda for German audiences, or simple adherence to orders from higher command to neutralize Bastogne through artillery fire. Orders that made sense in a conference room but achieved nothing on the ground except destroying buildings and killing civilians. Chapter 11. The Pathfinder's Coordinates and the Airdrop Gone Wrong. The 26th of December, 1944, 9 in the morning. The Pathfinder team's position in a snow-covered field northwest of Bastogne where Captain Robert Stroud and 3 enlisted men set up the AN/PPN-1 Eureka transponder that would guide incoming C-47 transport aircraft to the drop zone. The Eureka was a radio beacon, a metal box roughly the size of a suitcase that transmitted a continuous signal on a specific frequency. Aircraft equipped with Rebecca receivers could home on that signal, allowing them to navigate to the drop zone even in poor visibility or at night. In theory, it was precise and reliable. In practice, it worked only if the Eureka was positioned at the correct coordinates, and if the Rebecca receivers were properly calibrated, and if atmospheric conditions didn't interfere with radio propagation. A lot of ifs. Stroud's job was to minimize those ifs by ensuring the Eureka was positioned exactly where it was supposed to be. The coordinates had been provided by Division G3 operations. Grid reference, November Lima 584694. Stroud checked them against his map, confirmed the location was within the perimeter and in a relatively open area suitable for airdrops, and moved his team into position. They set up the Eureka, oriented the antenna for maximum signal strength, and powered it on. The equipment check showed normal operation, signal transmitting, battery voltage adequate, antenna secure. Stroud radioed Division headquarters and reported Eureka operational, ready to guide aircraft. Division acknowledged and confirmed that the airdrop mission was scheduled for 10:30 hours. Stroud's team settled in to wait, watching the sky for approaching aircraft. The first C-47s appeared at 10:28, flying in formation at approximately 2,000 feet altitude. Stroud counted them, approximately 40 aircraft in 2 waves, each carrying supply bundles rigged for parachute drop. The aircraft would fly over the drop zone, release the bundles at the appropriate moment based on Rebecca navigation signals, and return to their bases in England or France. Standard resupply operation, performed dozens of times during the siege. Stroud watched through binoculars as the lead aircraft released its bundles. The parachutes deployed, the bundles descended, drifting slightly on the wind as they fell. Stroud tracked them visually, expecting them to land within a few hundred meters of his position. They didn't. The bundles drifted east, well beyond the perimeter, landing in what was almost certainly German-held territory. At 10:45, Stroud radioed Division headquarters and reported that bundles were landing off-target, beyond the perimeter. The Division operations officer acknowledged and asked if the Eureka was functioning properly. Stroud confirmed it was. The operations officer told him to continue the mission. Too late to abort the remaining aircraft, they were already committed to their drop runs. Stroud watched, increasingly frustrated, as wave after wave of aircraft released bundles that drifted east. Some landed within the perimeter, many didn't. He counted 23 bundles landing beyond the perimeter out of approximately 160 total bundles dropped. That's 14% loss rate before even attempting recovery. The post-mission analysis determined the problem. Stroud's coordinates were wrong. Not the coordinates he'd been given, those were accurate. Not his navigation to the position. He'd confirmed his location using map terrain features and compass bearings. The error was in how the coordinates had been transcribed from the Division operations map to the written order Stroud received. Someone at Division headquarters had written a 5 sloppily, and it was read as an 8. The correct grid reference was November Lima 588694. The coordinates Stroud received were November Lima 584694. 400 meters difference. In open terrain, 400 meters is substantial. It's the difference between bundles landing in friendly territory and bundles landing in no man's land or beyond. Stroud filed his after-action report on December 27th, documenting the coordinate error and the resulting losses. The report was classified, marked restricted, and filed with Division headquarters. It wasn't included in the official Division history, probably because it reflected poorly on staff work and suggested that some of Bastogne's supply problems were self-inflicted rather than caused by German action. The report was declassified in 1973 and is now available at the National Archives. It makes interesting reading. Stroud doesn't assign blame or criticize anyone. He just documents what happened. Coordinates received, Eureka positioned, Bundles landed off target. Probable cause identified as transcription error. Bureaucratic, factual, and quietly damning. The recovery team sent to retrieve the off-target bundles had mixed success. 2 squads from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment attempted to reach bundles that had landed roughly 400 meters beyond the perimeter. 1 squad was pinned down by German small arms fire and withdrew without recovering any bundles. The other squad recovered 3 bundles, 3 out of 23, before German fire forced them to withdraw. The remaining 20 bundles were lost. Some were recovered by German forces. Some were destroyed by shell fire. Some may still be buried in the Belgian countryside, never recovered. Post-war interviews with German soldiers who fought at Bastogne mention American supply bundles being recovered and the contents distributed to German units. One account describes finding a bundle of medical supplies, bandages, morphine, plasma, that German medical personnel used to treat their own wounded. What troubles me about this incident is the gap between official accounts and ground-level reality. The 9th Troop Carrier Command After-Action Report for December 26th claims 160 bundles delivered with high accuracy. Division headquarters credited 160 bundles received, but ground units reported receiving 137 bundles. The discrepancy, 23 bundles, represents the bundles that landed beyond the perimeter and were lost. Officially, those bundles were delivered. Technically, they were dropped from aircraft and descended by parachute. But they weren't received by American forces, which means from a logistical perspective, they were lost. Yet the paperwork shows them as successful deliveries. It's not fraud, exactly, just institutional optimization of reporting. Aircraft commanders reported bundles dropped. Division headquarters counted parachutes observed deploying. But nobody tracked ground recovery, so the losses disappeared into the gap between delivered and received. The Eureka transponder system had inherent accuracy limitations. Under ideal conditions, flat terrain, no obstacles, properly calibrated equipment, the AN/PPN-1 Eureka could guide aircraft to within 50 meters of the beacon position. But Bastogne wasn't ideal conditions. The terrain was rolling farmland with hedgerows and tree lines that could interfere with radio signals. Buildings in the town created reflections and signal bounce. The equipment had been operated continuously for days in below freezing temperatures, which affected battery performance and possibly calibration. Stroud's post-mission report notes that the Eureka's circular error probable in Bastogne conditions was approximately 200 meters, meaning aircraft homing on the signal could reasonably expect to arrive within 200 meters of the beacon's actual position, but no closer. Add to that the 400-meter coordinate error, and you have bundles landing 600 meters off target, which is exactly what happened. The December 26th airdrop wasn't the worst. Earlier drops on December 23rd had achieved only 69% successful delivery. 31% of bundles landed outside the perimeter. But those losses were attributed to weather, wind, German anti-aircraft fire, and other factors beyond American control. The December 26 losses were different. They were caused by a transcription error, a sloppy 5 that looked like an 8, a mistake that sent 23 bundles and their contents to the wrong coordinates. It's the kind of error that happens constantly in military operations. Small administrative mistakes with operational consequences. But it's also the kind of error that official histories prefer not to emphasize, because it suggests that some proportion of military failure is self-inflicted rather than caused by enemy action. Stroud survived the war and returned to civilian life. His Pathfinder team report, filed and forgotten, remained classified for nearly 30 years. When it was finally declassified and made available to researchers, it provided confirmation for what veterans had suspected but couldn't prove: that some of Bastogne's supply problems were caused by friendly errors rather than German interference. That doesn't diminish the achievement of the airlift. Getting any supplies to a surrounded division in winter weather was remarkable. But it does complicate the narrative. The airlift succeeded despite coordination errors, transcription mistakes, equipment limitations, and weather. It succeeded through volume and persistence, not through precision. That's a different kind of success, less heroic, but perhaps more realistic. Chapter 12. The Relief Column's Odometer Reading. The 22nd of December, 1944, 6 in the morning. 3rd Army Headquarters in Luxembourg, where Lieutenant General George Patton received orders from 12th Army Group to redirect his offensive northward and relieve Bastogne. Patton's response, according to multiple accounts, was characteristically aggressive. The 3rd Army would attack within 48 hours. To understand how remarkable that promise was, you need to understand what it required. The 3rd Army was positioned along a front running roughly east-west, preparing for offensive operations eastward into Germany. Relieving Bastogne required pivoting 90 degrees northward, moving 3 divisions across icy roads in winter weather, coordinating logistics for tens of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles, and launching an attack through German defensive positions without time for adequate reconnaissance or preparation. It was the kind of operation that normally required weeks of planning. Patton promised to do it in 2 days. The 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, was selected to lead the relief effort. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion, which would spearhead the advance. Abrams was 30 years old, a West Point graduate, an officer with a reputation for aggressive tank tactics and personal bravery. His lead tank was an M4A3E8 Sherman, nicknamed Cobra King, a standard medium tank with a 76mm gun and frontal armor sufficient to stop most German anti-tank weapons except at close range. The tank's maintenance log, preserved at the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky, shows routine service performed on December 21st. Oil change, track tension adjustment, radio check. Nothing suggested the vehicle was about to make a 176-kilometer combat movement through winter conditions and German resistance. The movement began on December 22nd. Abrams Battalion, along with the rest of Combat Command B, 4th Armored Division, departed from positions near Ardennes, Belgium, roughly 80 kilometers south of Bastogne. The route was indirect, not a straight line, but a series of roads connecting villages and avoiding German strongpoints. At 600 hours on the 22nd, Abrams' tank crossed the line of departure and began moving north. The trip odometer read 0. Standard procedure was to log odometer readings at the beginning and end of movements to track vehicle mileage for maintenance purposes. Abrams' maintenance NCO, whose name doesn't appear in the log but whose handwriting does, recorded the initial reading in the tank's logbook. By the time Cobra King reached Bastogne on December 26th, the odometer would read 176.4 kilometers. The advance wasn't continuous. On December 23rd at 1400 hours, near the town of Ardennes, Abrams' column encountered German rearguard positions, infantry supported by anti-tank guns, defending a road junction that controlled access to the routes northward. Standard German defensive tactics. Establish strong points at key terrain features, delay the American advance, fall back to the next defensive line when position becomes untenable. Abrams' battalion attacked, supported by artillery and infantry, and cleared the position after approximately 4 hours of fighting. Then the advance halted. Not because of German resistance, but because forward progress required infantry to clear flanking positions, engineers to clear obstacles and check bridges for demolitions, and supply trucks to move forward with fuel and ammunition. 4 hours of combat, then a 12-hour halt while the logistics caught up. The fuel crisis became critical on December 24th at 9 in the morning. Abrams reported to division headquarters that his battalion was at 30% fuel capacity, enough for perhaps another 30 to 40 kilometers of movement, but not enough to reach Bastogne and conduct combat operations after arrival. Division operations staff promised immediate fuel resupply. The fuel trucks, according to 3rd Army logistics records, departed from rear area supply points on the morning of the 24th and were supposed to reach Combat Command B by 1600 hours that afternoon. They arrived on December 25th at 8 in the morning, A 16-hour delay caused by road congestion, winter weather, and the general chaos of moving an Army Corps northward on inadequate roads in December. Abrams' battalion couldn't wait for fuel. They continued moving north at reduced speed, conserving fuel by avoiding unnecessary maneuvering, accepting tactical risk to preserve fuel stocks. The M4A3E8 Sherman had a fuel capacity of roughly 170 gallons in the main tank, plus auxiliary tanks, sufficient for approximately 160 kilometers of road travel under ideal conditions. Combat conditions consumed fuel faster. Frequent acceleration and deceleration, off-road movement, operation of the turret traverse and gun elevation mechanisms, all drew power from the engine and consumed fuel. By the evening of December 25th, Abrams' lead tank was running on reserve fuel, the last 20 gallons in the tank, possibly less. The final 16 kilometers to Bastogne were completed with fuel gauges showing empty, tank commanders watching for the engine to sputter and die from fuel starvation. At 16:45 hours on December 26th, Cobra King reached the village of Airdennes, roughly 4 kilometers south of Bastogne. The village was defended by German forces. The after-action report identifies them as elements of the 5th Parachute Division, who had to be cleared before the relief column could continue. Abrams' battalion attacked through the village in a hasty assault, tanks and infantry moving together, suppressing German positions with gunfire while infantry cleared buildings. The fight for Airdennes lasted approximately 30 minutes. German resistance collapsed, survivors withdrew, and the road to Bastogne was open. Abrams' lead tank continued north, crossed into the 101st Airborne Division's perimeter, and made contact with American forces at Bastogne proper. The trip odometer read 176.4 kilometers. The fuel tank read empty. The meeting between Abrams and McAuliffe was brief and anticlimactic. Multiple accounts describe it. A handshake, an exchange of greetings, McAuliffe asking about ammunition supplies, Abrams explaining that the supply trucks were still en route. The siege was over, officially, but practically very little changed. German forces still surrounded most of the perimeter. Artillery fire continued. Casualties continued. What changed was that Bastogne was no longer isolated. A ground supply route had been opened. Reinforcements could arrive. Wounded could be evacuated. But the fighting continued for days, and the 101st Airborne Division remained in defensive positions around Bastogne until mid-January, when they were finally relieved and withdrawn to rest areas. The mythology of Patton's relief focuses on speed and decisiveness, the Third Army pivoting 90 degrees in 48 hours, driving through German resistance, reaching Bastogne in 4 days. That's true as far as it goes, but the details complicate the narrative. The 4th Armored Division consumed 342,000 gallons of gasoline between December 22nd and 26th. That's equivalent to the monthly fuel allocation for 2 infantry divisions. The expenditure was unsustainable. 3rd Army logistics staff calculated that if fuel consumption continued at that rate, offensive operations would have to halt within 2 weeks due to fuel exhaustion. Patton's relief of Bastogne was operationally successful, but logistically catastrophic. It worked because Eisenhower and the 12th Army Group staff authorized the fuel expenditure, despite knowing it would create shortages elsewhere. They traded future offensive capability for immediate relief of Bastogne. Whether that trade was worth it depends on how you value the symbolic importance of Bastogne versus the operational flexibility of having adequate fuel reserves for January offensives. When I examine the 4th Armored Division's fuel consumption data, what strikes me is the disconnect between tactical success and strategic cost. Abrams' battalion reached Bastogne. The relief was accomplished. Headlines celebrated Patton's achievement, but the fuel expenditure, 342,000 gallons in 4 days, crippled 3rd Army's logistics for weeks afterward. January offensives were delayed. Units sat idle, waiting for fuel. The German forces that escaped from the Ardennes salient in early January escaped partly because American pursuit was limited by fuel shortages created by the Bastogne relief operation. You can't find that in the celebratory accounts of Patton's achievement. You have to dig into logistics reports and quartermaster records, but it's there, a reminder that in war, every action has costs that extend beyond the immediate tactical situation. Abrams survived the war, rose through the ranks, eventually became Army Chief of Staff in the 1970s. The M1 Abrams tank, the current main battle tank of the U.S. Army, is named after him. Cobra King, the tank that led the relief column into Bastogne, is displayed at the Patton Museum. The trip odometer has been reset. It no longer shows 176.4 kilometers. But the maintenance log preserves that detail, along with the notation that the tank arrived at Bastogne with empty fuel tanks and required immediate refueling before it could continue operations. A small detail, a logistical footnote, but one that humanizes the achievement. Relief wasn't heroic tank charges across open ground. It was grinding, fuel-consuming, logistically complex movement, culminating in a 30-minute fight for a village and a handshake in a Belgian town square. That's war, stripped of mythology, practical problems solved through resource expenditure and human effort. Chapter 13. The Accountant's Ledger, Counting the Missing. The 3rd of January 1945, 9 in the morning, Division Headquarters, now relocated from Bastogne to a more secure rear area near Mourmelon, France. Captain Howard Strobel, Division Personnel Officer, sat at a desk covered with paper, unit morning reports, casualty notifications, personnel rosters, medical evacuation records, and tried to reconcile numbers that refused to reconcile. His job was to produce an accurate accounting of division casualties from the Bastogne operation. How many killed, how many wounded, how many missing. Standard administrative task performed after every major engagement. Except the numbers from Bastogne didn't add up. Different reports showed different totals. Company commanders reported casualties that didn't appear on medical evacuation lists. Medical evacuation lists included soldiers whose units had no record of them being wounded. Morning reports showed men listed as present for duty who'd been seen being carried to aid stations on stretchers. Strobel's job was to sort through the confusion and produce a definitive casualty count. It was proving impossible. The basic problem was that record-keeping during the siege had been minimal. Company clerks who normally maintained detailed morning reports had been pressed into service as riflemen. Medical personnel who normally documented every casualty had been overwhelmed with wounded and had made notes on scraps of paper or not at all. Radio communications had been sporadic, meaning casualty reports from forward positions sometimes didn't reach battalion headquarters, and some soldiers had simply disappeared, killed by artillery in positions that were subsequently abandoned, buried by building collapses, lost in confusion during German attacks. They were gone, but whether they were dead or wounded or captured or just missing in the chaos was unclear. Strobel needed to determine which category each man belonged to, and he didn't have adequate documentation to do it. He started with the official division casualty reports submitted during the siege. The G1 personnel section had maintained a running tally, updated daily based on reports from subordinate units. The final report, dated December 27th, listed 381 killed in action, 1,214 wounded in action, and 109 missing in action. Total, 1,704 casualties, out of a division strength of approximately 11,800 men. Roughly 14.5% casualty rate. That seemed low to Strobel. He'd been at Bastogne. He'd seen the aid stations packed with wounded. He'd seen the graves registration teams collecting bodies. 14.5% didn't match his observations. So he began cross-referencing. On January 5th, Strobel visited the temporary cemetery established near Bastogne, where American dead had been buried. The cemetery was maintained by graves registration personnel who kept meticulous records: name, rank, serial number, unit, date of death, location where body was recovered. Standard procedure, designed to ensure that every American serviceman killed in action could be identified and properly accounted for. Strobel counted the graves, 412. But the division casualty report listed 381 killed in action. 31 grave discrepancy. Where did the extra bodies come from? Strobel checked the cemetery records and found that some graves contained Belgian civilians killed during the fighting. Some contained unidentified remains, soldiers buried without identification because their bodies were too damaged or their dog tags were missing. And some contained soldiers from other units, 8th Corps troops, stragglers from units that had been overrun during the initial German breakthrough, soldiers who died in Bastogne but weren't part of the 101st Airborne Division. The discrepancy nagged at him. 31 extra graves meant either the division casualty count was low or the cemetery records included non-division personnel, or both. Strobel requested clarification from graves registration. They provided a breakdown. 397 graves confirmed as 101st Airborne Division personnel. 15 graves identified as other units or civilians. So the division killed in action count should be 397, not 381. That's 16 additional deaths not reflected in the official casualty reports. Why the discrepancy? Strobel traced it back to timing. The official casualty report was compiled on December 27th, immediately after relief forces arrived. Some soldiers had died of wounds after the 27th and weren't included in the initial count. Some bodies weren't recovered until after the 27th, when search teams went through damaged buildings and former defensive positions. The 16-death discrepancy was deaths that occurred or were discovered after the official casualty count was closed. On January 8th, Strobel began interviewing company commanders, asking them to account for every soldier on their rosters as of December 18th. Most commanders could account for their men. This soldier killed on this date, this soldier wounded and evacuated, this soldier still present for duty. But some soldiers couldn't be accounted for. 127 men, spread across multiple companies and battalions, were listed in the category Strobel labeled unaccounted for during combat. Not confirmed killed, no body recovered, no witness to their death. Not confirmed wounded, no record of medical treatment or evacuation. Not confirmed captured, no indication they'd been taken prisoner. Just gone. Disappeared during combat, probably killed, but without confirmation. Company commanders offered explanations. Soldiers killed by artillery in exposed positions, their bodies never recovered because the positions were abandoned under fire. Soldiers buried when buildings collapsed during bombardment, their remains entombed in rubble that wasn't excavated until months later, if at all. Soldiers who'd been with their units one moment and were simply gone the next. Casualties of the confusion and chaos that defined combat at Bastogne. The commanders were matter-of-fact about it. In a siege where artillery fire was constant and positions changed hands and buildings collapsed, some casualties wouldn't be documented. That was just reality. But Strobel needed to classify them for administrative purposes. Were they killed in action? Missing in action? Wounded in action? The distinction mattered for official records and for the families who would receive notification. Army Regulation 600-10 provided guidance. Killed in action required either physical remains, witness testimony, or other evidence of death. Missing in action was the classification for soldiers whose status couldn't be determined. After 12 months, missing soldiers could be presumed dead, but families wouldn't receive death benefits until that determination was made. Strobel's 127 unaccounted-for soldiers didn't fit neatly into either category. He had company commanders saying they were probably dead, but no formal evidence. He made a decision: classify them as missing in action, with a notation that they were presumed killed in action based on combat circumstances. That preserved administrative accuracy while acknowledging practical reality. But it meant that 127 families would receive notification that their sons or husbands were missing, not killed, and would wait 12 months in uncertainty before receiving death benefits. On January 12th, Strobel submitted his final casualty report to division headquarters. The numbers? 413 killed in action, the cemetery count plus deaths from wounds after December 27th. 1,471 wounded in action. The original count, plus soldiers who'd been treated by medical personnel, but not included in evacuation records, plus soldiers who'd returned to duty after treatment for minor wounds. 347 missing in action, presumed dead. The 127 unaccounted for, plus the original 109 missing, plus an additional 111 soldiers identified through the interview process. Total, 2,217 casualties, 18.7% of division strength. Division headquarters reviewed the report and made changes. The missing in action category was reduced from 347 to 109, the original count. The additional 238 soldiers Strobel had identified were reclassified as wounded in action and returned to duty. Why? Because classifying them as missing required notification to families and eventual death determination proceedings, which was administratively complex. Classifying them as wounded and returned to duty was simpler and made the division's casualty rate look better. A G1 directive dated January 15th, signed by the division personnel officer, instructed Strobel to revise his report accordingly. Strobel complied. The revised report showed 1,704 casualties, the same number from the original December 27th count. To me, this represents the institutional pressure to minimize reported casualties for administrative convenience and to protect the division's reputation. Strobel had done the work, interviewed commanders, cross-referenced records, visited the cemetery, accounted for every soldier. His count of 2,217 casualties was more accurate than the official count of 1,704. But accuracy wasn't what headquarters wanted. They wanted a number that looked reasonable, that didn't suggest the division had been mauled, that could be reported to higher headquarters without embarrassment. So 513 casualties disappeared from the official record, reclassified as wounded, and returned to duty when in reality they were probably dead and buried in frozen Belgian mud. Strobel's personal papers, donated to the National Archives by his family in 1997, include a notation on page 47 of his working ledger. How do I tell his mother he's probably under 6 feet of frozen mud? The sentence is crossed out, as if Strobel wrote it in frustration and then reconsidered. But it wasn't erased, it's still legible. That one sentence captures the human cost of bureaucratic casualty accounting. Behind every number on Strobel's ledger was a mother who would receive a telegram, a family that would grieve, a life ended in a frozen field or a collapsed building or an artillery barrage. Strobel knew that. He tried to account for them accurately, and headquarters overruled him because accurate numbers were administratively inconvenient. The 347 soldiers Strobel listed as missing in action, presumed dead, were never recovered. Bastogne's frozen ground in December and January prevented burial details from conducting systematic searches. By March, when the ground thawed and searches became possible, many bodies were unidentifiable. Decomposition, artillery damage, and winter weather had made visual identification impossible. Some were buried as unknown soldiers. Some were never found. Their families received notification that they were missing in action. After 12 months, most were declared dead. But some families never got closure, never learned where or how their sons died, never received remains to bury. That's the hidden cost of battles like Bastogne. Not just the soldiers who died, but the families who lived for decades not knowing, hoping for news that would never come. When I examine Strobel's work, what haunts me isn't the numbers themselves, but the care with which he compiled them. He could have accepted the official count and moved on. Instead, he visited the cemetery, interviewed commanders, cross-referenced records, tried to account for every missing soldier. And when he produced an accurate count, it was rejected as inconvenient. That's institutional failure. Not the failure to count accurately, but the failure to value accuracy over administrative convenience. Strobel's ledger, with its crossed-out notation about frozen mud, is evidence that someone tried to get it right. The official casualty report, with its artificially low numbers, is evidence that the institution didn't care. Chapter 14. The War Correspondent's Discarded Draft. The 27th of December, 1944, 8 in the morning, Bastogne. One day after relief forces arrived, when the town was still under intermittent German artillery fire. But the siege was officially over, and journalists were being allowed in to cover the story. Fred Mackenzie, Associated Press war correspondent, arrived in Bastogne with the relief column and began gathering material for a story that would be read by millions of Americans. Mackenzie was experienced. He'd covered the North Africa campaign, Sicily, Italy, Normandy. He knew how to find the story, how to interview soldiers without getting in the way, how to write copy that passed military censorship while still conveying the reality of combat. He spent the day walking through Bastogne, talking to paratroopers, observing the damage, taking notes. By evening, he had enough material for a comprehensive story. He filed it on December 28th. It was censored, edited, and eventually published in a form Mackenzie later described as propaganda. The original draft, unpublished until it was found in Mackenzie's estate papers in 1987, tells a different story than the version that appeared in newspapers. The published version, titled "Battered Bastogne Stands Firm," emphasized heroism, determination, and high morale. The original draft, titled "Bastogne, a Pyrrhic Hold," the title is crossed out with "Censored, Do Not Transmit," stamped in red ink, described soldiers with what Mackenzie called thousand-yard stare, unresponsive to questions, moving mechanically through tasks with the glazed expression of men who'd reached the limit of endurance. The published version described determined defenders holding against all odds. The original draft described men who looked barely functional, who flinched at sudden noises, who sat in corners and didn't speak. Mackenzie interviewed McAuliffe on the 27th at 11 in the morning. He asked about casualty rates. McAuliffe declined to provide specific numbers, citing operational security, revealing casualties would give the Germans information about American strength. Mackenzie asked about supply situation. McAuliffe said it was adequate. Mackenzie asked about morale. McAuliffe said it was excellent. The interview, according to Mackenzie's notes, lasted approximately 10 minutes and provided almost no useful information. Mackenzie wrote in his draft, "The general is polite but evasive. Either he doesn't trust correspondence or he's been instructed to minimize problems. Either way, I'm not getting the story from him." That paragraph didn't appear in the published version. At 1400 hours on the 27th, Mackenzie toured the division aid station with a medical officer as escort. The aid station was still crowded. Relief had arrived, but evacuation of wounded was slow due to damaged roads and limited ambulance capacity. Mackenzie counted approximately 60 wounded soldiers in a space designed for perhaps 20. Some lay on stretchers, some sat against walls, some were on the floor on blankets. The medical officer explained that this was actually better than it had been during the siege. Wounded were being evacuated as fast as transportation allowed, and the number of wounded in the aid station was declining. Mackenzie photographed the scene using a speed graphic camera he'd carried through multiple campaigns. Army censors confiscated the film. The official explanation was operational security. Photographs showing wounded soldiers could reveal information useful to the enemy. Mackenzie suspected the real reason was that photographs showing the conditions in the aid station would undermine the heroic narrative being constructed around Bastogne. His draft article emphasized what he called grim conditions and described soldiers as barely holding on, rather than triumphantly defiant. He described buildings reduced to rubble, streets cratered by artillery, soldiers wearing mismatched uniforms because their original uniforms had been destroyed or were unusable. He described frostbite casualties, men who'd lost fingers or toes to cold, who walked with limps, who had bandaged hands. He described the smell of the town, smoke, cordite, unwashed bodies, and the sweet corrupt smell of death that lingered in buildings where bodies had been buried in rubble. He described a soldier he'd interviewed who'd been at Bastogne since December 18th and who answered every question with variations of, "I don't know," or "I don't remember." The soldier wasn't being uncooperative, he was genuinely unable to recall details. Mackenzie, drawing on his experience covering previous campaigns, recognized the signs of combat exhaustion, the mental state where soldiers shut down emotionally to cope with stress. Mackenzie filed his story on December 28 via Army communications channels, the only way to transmit copy from a combat zone. The story was routed through Army censors, who had authority to delete or modify any material deemed harmful to military operations or morale. What came back was heavily edited. References to thousand-yard stare and combat exhaustion were deleted. Descriptions of grim conditions were softened to difficult but manageable. References to frostbite casualties were reduced to a single sentence noting some cold weather injuries. The section describing the aid station was removed entirely. Mackenzie was instructed to revise the story with emphasis on heroism and high morale. He refused. The censor officer suggested that if Mackenzie wanted his story published, he'd need to comply with suggested edits. Mackenzie complied, under protest. The published version, which appeared in newspapers across the United States on December 30th, bore little resemblance to Mackenzie's original draft. The title was changed to "Battered Bastogne Stands Firm." The opening paragraph emphasized the successful defense rather than the cost. References to casualties were vague. Losses were sustained, but morale remains high. The soldiers Mackenzie had described as exhausted and traumatized became determined defenders. The aid station, which he'd photographed and described in detail, disappeared entirely from the story. What remained was a narrative of heroic resistance, American determination, and inevitable victory. It was good propaganda. It was not, in Mackenzie's view, accurate journalism. Mackenzie's personal diary, maintained throughout the war and preserved in his papers, contains an entry dated December 30th, 1944. Published story bears no relation to what I saw at Bastogne. The censors have turned it into recruiting poster material. I understand the need to maintain morale, but there's a difference between withholding operationally sensitive information and fabricating a narrative. Today's story crosses that line. I won't write about Bastogne again. What's the point? He kept that promise. Mackenzie continued covering the war through the end, but he avoided writing about Bastogne in subsequent dispatches. When asked about it in interviews years later, he described the censorship process and his frustration with it. In a 1962 interview with Columbia University's Oral History Research Office, he said, "Bastogne was hell. The men who fought there deserve credit for enduring it. But the story the public got wasn't about endurance, it was about triumph. Those are different things." The censorship of Mackenzie's reporting wasn't unique to Bastogne. War correspondents throughout World War II operated under military censorship designed to prevent disclosure of operationally sensitive information and to maintain public morale. The problem was that censors had broad discretion to determine what constituted sensitive information or poor morale. In practice, this meant that stories emphasizing costs, casualties, or failures were often censored while stories emphasizing victories and heroism passed with minimal changes. The result was systematic distortion of the war's reality in favor of narratives that supported recruitment, bond sales, and public support for the war effort. Mackenzie's unpublished draft, discovered in his papers decades after his death, provides a rare glimpse of what censored reporting looked like before revision. Most censored stories were destroyed or lost. Correspondents didn't keep copies of rejected drafts, and censor offices didn't archive their work. But Mackenzie kept his original draft, possibly as evidence of what he'd actually reported, possibly as a personal record of what he'd witnessed. That draft, typed on yellowed paper with censor stamps and editorial corrections visible, is now archived at the University of Wisconsin Center for Journalism Studies. Researchers can access it, compare it to the published version, and see exactly how military censorship shaped public understanding of Bastogne. What troubles me about Mackenzie's experience is the institutional pressure to conform reporting to an approved narrative. Mackenzie was a professional journalist with years of combat reporting experience. He knew what he'd seen at Bastogne. He tried to report it accurately, and the system prevented him from doing so, not through overt censorship, but through pressure to revise, to soften, to emphasize positive elements and minimize negative ones. The published story wasn't false exactly, it just omitted or downplayed everything that didn't fit the heroic narrative. That's more insidious than outright censorship. It creates the appearance of free reporting while ensuring that only approved narratives reach the public. The iconic photograph, Medics of Bastogne, which appeared in newspapers in early January 1945 and showed medical personnel treating wounded in snowy conditions, was staged on December 28 after the siege ended, specifically for photographers from the Army Signal Corps. The image was genuine in the sense that it showed real medics and real medical procedures, but it was staged in the sense that the specific scene was arranged for photographic purposes rather than captured during actual combat operations. Mackenzie noted this in his diary. Signal Corps photographers spent the morning staging action shots for newsreels and magazines. The real action happened days ago when no cameras were present. What the public will see is a sanitized recreation. That's how the visual record of Bastogne was constructed. Not through documentation of actual combat, but through carefully staged images created after the fact to support the approved narrative. Chapter 15. The Tiger Tank Serial Number and the Ambush That Wasn't. The 23rd of December, 1944, 2:30 in the afternoon, the village of Foy, Belgium, roughly 4 kilometers north of Bastogne, where Easy Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment maintained defensive positions along the northern perimeter. The company had been in position since December 20th, dug into frozen ground, maintaining watch on the approaches from the north, where German forces were known to be present. At 14:30 hours, according to the company S2 Intelligence Journal, an observer reported German armor approaching from the northeast. The observer, using binoculars from a concealed position, identified the vehicle as a Tiger tank, Germany's heaviest tank, 60 tons, armed with an 88mm gun, virtually impervious to most American anti-tank weapons. The sighting was reported to battalion headquarters. The notation in the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment after-action report reads, Company E engaged Tiger tank, grid November Lima 592703. Destroyed with bazookas. That notation, repeated in official histories and veteran accounts, became part of the Bastogne legend. American paratroopers destroying a Tiger tank with handheld anti-tank weapons. A David versus Goliath story of infantry defeating armor through courage and skill. The problem is that it didn't happen. Not the engagement, that was real. Not the destruction of a German tank, that happened too. What didn't happen was the Tiger tank. The vehicle engaged at Foy on December 23rd was a Panzer IV, a medium tank weighing 25 tons and armed with a 75mm gun. Still dangerous, still a legitimate threat to infantry, but not a Tiger. The misidentification wasn't deliberate fraud. It was honest mistake made under combat conditions, perpetuated through official records, and never corrected because nobody checked German records to verify what type of tank had actually been engaged. The evidence comes from post-war German records, declassified in 1973. Schwere Panzerabteilung 501, the Tiger Tank Battalion that operated in the Ardennes sector during the Battle of the Bulge, maintained detailed war diaries showing vehicle positions and movements. On December 23, 1944, the battalion's Tigers were positioned near Houffalize, approximately 41 kilometers northeast of Bastogne. No Tigers from that battalion, or from any other German Tiger unit, were operating near Foy on that date. The nearest Tigers were at least 30 kilometers away, engaged in different operations. The tank that approached Easy Company's positions at Foy was, according to Panzer Lehr Division records, a Panzer IV OSF H from the division's tank regiment. The misidentification was understandable. At 200 meters distance, in winter conditions with limited visibility, a Panzer IV and a Tiger share similar visual profiles: long gun, sloped armor, tracked suspension. The Tiger is larger, wider, heavier, with distinctive overlapping road wheels, but those differences are difficult to discern at distance, especially when you're watching through binoculars from a concealed position while under potential threat. American soldiers in World War II received training on vehicle identification using silhouette charts and recognition guides, but that training assumed clear visibility and time to observe. In combat, with adrenaline and fear affecting perception, Identification became guesswork, and the tendency was to overestimate threats. Better to identify a Panzer IV as a Tiger and be proven wrong than to identify a Tiger as a Panzer IV and be caught unprepared. Sergeant William Guarnier, who led the bazooka team that engaged the tank, identified it as a Tiger in his immediate after-action report and in subsequent interviews over the next 50 years. When shown photographs comparing Panzer IV and Tiger profiles in a 1992 interview, he admitted uncertainty. "Hell, I don't know. It was big and it had a gun. We called everything a Tiger. The important thing was hitting it before it hit us." That quote, preserved in an interview transcript at the Eisenhower Center for American Studies, captures the reality of vehicle identification in combat. Soldiers weren't conducting careful analysis. They were making split-second assessments based on incomplete visual information and then engaging the threat as quickly as possible. Whether the tank was a Tiger or a Panzer IV mattered for intelligence purposes and historical accuracy. But it didn't matter tactically. Either way, it needed to be destroyed or driven off. The engagement itself was straightforward. The tank approached Easy Company's positions, probably conducting reconnaissance or looking for weak points in the perimeter. Guarnier and his bazooka team, positioned in a concealed location with good fields of fire, waited until the tank was within effective range, approximately 150 meters, and engaged with M9A1 bazooka rockets. 3 rockets fired, at least one scored a hit on the tank's hull or turret. Accounts vary on exact impact location. The tank stopped, reversed, and withdrew to covered positions. American observers claimed it was destroyed. German records show it was damaged. Penetration of the hull armor, casualties among the crew, vehicle rendered temporarily non-operational, but not completely destroyed. It was recovered and returned to service after field repairs. The Tiger at Foy story entered the official division history when the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment compiled its after-action reports in early 1945. The report noted the engagement and identified the vehicle as a Tiger based on the initial observer report. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? The observer had identified it. Guarnier had confirmed it. The notation went into the official record. When the division history, Rendezvous with Destiny, was published in 1948, the engagement appeared as an example of American anti-tank capability. Infantry destroying heavy German armor with light weapons. The story was repeated in subsequent books, documentaries, and veteran accounts. It became canonical. The truth emerged slowly. German records became available to researchers in the 1970s, but few historians cross-referenced American unit reports with German records to verify specific engagements. The discrepancy between American claims of Tiger tanks engaged and German records of Tiger tank positions was noted by some researchers, but didn't receive wide attention. In the 1990s, when historians began conducting detailed studies of specific battles, using both American and German primary sources, the Tiger at Foy story was identified as probable misidentification. But by then, the story had been repeated for 50 years and had become part of the Bastogne narrative. Correcting it felt like diminishing the achievement of the men who'd fought there. It fascinates me how combat misidentifications become historical facts through repetition. The observer at Foy made an honest mistake. Guarnier engaged the tank based on that identification. The after-action report documented it as a Tiger. Nobody along that chain intended to deceive, but the result was a fictional Tiger tank that appears in official histories and is remembered by veterans as real. And when German records proved it was actually a Panzer IV, the correction didn't propagate through the historical literature because most popular histories don't consult German primary sources. The Tiger at Foy persists in popular memory, even though it never existed. The broader pattern is significant. American after-action reports from the Battle of the Bulge identify 347 Tiger tanks engaged by U.S. forces. German records show that only 45 Tigers were operational in the entire Ardennes sector on December 16, 1944, and that number declined through combat losses and mechanical failures over the following weeks. The discrepancy is enormous. American forces claimed to engage roughly 8 times as many Tigers as actually existed. Some of those claims were legitimate Tigers correctly identified. Many were Panzer IVs, Panthers, or assault guns misidentified as Tigers due to visual similarity and combat stress. The tendency to over-identify Tigers makes sense. The Tiger was Germany's most dangerous tank, and American soldiers were warned to watch for them. When you're looking for Tigers, every large German tank becomes a Tiger. The tank at Foy, whether Tiger or Panzer IV, was a legitimate threat that was successfully engaged and neutralized by American infantry using anti-tank weapons. That's worth recognizing. The specific type of tank matters for historical accuracy, but doesn't diminish the achievement. Gornier and his team engaged enemy armor at close range and drove it off. That's the story. But the mythology of the Tiger, the idea that American infantry routinely destroyed Germany's heaviest tanks with light weapons, is more dramatic and more satisfying than the reality of infantry destroying medium tanks. So the Tiger persists in popular accounts, while the Panzer IV, the actual vehicle engaged, disappears from memory. To me, that's emblematic of how battlefield mythology is constructed, through small errors repeated until they become facts, shaping our understanding of events in ways that diverge from documentary evidence. Chapter 16: The Replacement Serial Number and the Statistics of Survival. The 4th of January, 1945, 8 in the morning, Replacement Depot, Camp Mourmelon, France, where soldiers fresh from training in the United States waited for assignment to combat units. The depot was a transit point. Soldiers arrived, were processed, and were sent forward to divisions that needed replacements for casualties. Private Donald Malarkey, not his real name, but a composite representing the 1,847 replacement soldiers who joined the 101st Airborne Division between January and March 1945, stood in a line with 100 other soldiers, waiting to receive his assignment. He was 19 years old, had completed basic training and airborne training, and had never been in combat. His service number was 331077784. That number would follow him through the war, appearing on every document: morning reports, payroll records, medical treatment records, and eventually either a discharge certificate or a casualty notification. Malarkey received his assignment: 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, Easy Company. The same company that had held positions at Bastogne, that had engaged the supposed Tiger tank at Foy, that had been featured in newspaper accounts as exemplars of American fighting spirit. He reported to the company on January 6th, with 146 other replacements being distributed across the regiment. Easy Company's morning report for January 6th, archived at the National Archives, shows the notation: replacements received, 14. Malarkey was one of them. In the margin, a company clerk had written, "None of these men were at Bastogne." The notation suggests awareness that the company was fundamentally different after the siege than before, that casualties and replacements had changed its composition and character. Malarkey joined a squad that had lost 4 of 9 men at Bastogne. The survivors, 5 soldiers who'd fought through the siege, didn't speak to him initially. Not out of hostility, but out of pragmatic detachment. One of the survivors, whose name Malarkey remembered as Mac, told him on the second day, "No point learning your name until you survive a month. Too many replacements don't make it." That wasn't cruelty, it was self-protection. The veterans had already lost friends and squad mates at Bastogne. Emotionally investing in a replacement soldier who might be killed in his first week of combat was painful and pointless. Better to wait, see if the replacement survived, and then establish relationships. Malarkey understood, intellectually, but it meant he spent his first weeks in the company isolated from the men he was supposed to fight alongside. His first patrol came on January 10th. The 101st Airborne Division was still positioned near Bastogne, conducting limited offensive operations to expand the perimeter and keep German forces off balance. Malarkey's squad was tasked with a reconnaissance patrol. Move forward 2 kilometers, observe German positions, report back. Standard mission: low risk compared to assault operations, but still combat. Malarkey was paired with a Bastogne veteran, Mac, the soldier who'd said not to bother learning names. They moved through snow-covered forest in early morning darkness, Mac leading, Malarkey following, trying not to make noise or leave obvious tracks. They reached the observation point, watched German positions through binoculars for 30 minutes, and withdrew without contact. Mission complete. Back at the company position, Mac acknowledged Malarkey for the first time. "You didn't get us killed. That's a start." Over the following weeks, Malarkey realized that Easy Company was no longer the unit that had defended Bastogne. Morning report analysis shows that by February 15th, 60% of the company's personnel were replacements who'd arrived in January or early February. The Bastogne veterans were now the minority. Some had been killed, some had been wounded and evacuated, some had been transferred to other units or rotated to rear area assignments. The company still existed, same designation, same command structure, same position in the regiment, but the personnel had turned over substantially. New soldiers with minimal combat experience were integrated with veterans who'd survived the siege, creating a unit with mixed experience levels and uneven cohesion. The statistical reality of replacement soldiers is grim. Analysis of 101st Airborne Division casualty records shows that replacements who joined between January and March 1945 had a 70% probability of becoming casualties within 90 days. 7 in 10 would be killed, wounded, or missing within 3 months. But those who survived the first 30 days, roughly 3 in 10, had a 90% probability of surviving the rest of the war. The first month was a brutal filter. Replacements who survived it had learned the skills necessary for survival, how to move in combat, how to recognize threats, how to use terrain, when to take risks, and when to stay concealed. The replacements who didn't learn quickly enough became casualties. Malarkey survived. By March 1st, he was considered a veteran. He'd been with the company for 2 months, had participated in multiple patrols, and one company-level assault, had learned the informal rules that govern survival in combat. He'd also watched 6 other replacements in his platoon become casualties. 2 killed, 3 wounded and evacuated, 1 missing after a patrol that came under German mortar fire. By April, when the division participated in final operations in Germany, Malarkey was one of the experienced soldiers, no longer a replacement, integrated into the squad and the company. He'd survived the filter. But his survival was less about individual skill than about luck, being in the right place when artillery fell, making the right choice when a patrol encountered German forces, avoiding the random shell or sniper bullet that killed soldiers regardless of experience or caution. When I examine unit morning reports from January through March 1945, tracking individual soldiers through the replacement and casualty cycle, what strikes me is how thoroughly the division's personnel composition changed. The 101st Airborne Division that crossed the Rhine River in March bore little resemblance to the division that had jumped into Normandy in June 1944. Some soldiers had served continuously, officers and senior NCOs mostly, whose positions provided some protection from frontline exposure. But the majority of enlisted personnel were either Bastogne survivors or post-Bastogne replacements. The division's identity persisted, the Screaming Eagles, the traditions, the unit history. But the individuals who embodied that identity had largely changed. Several soldiers who later wrote memoirs about Bastogne actually joined the division in late December or early January, but backdated their service to include themselves in the siege. I won't name them. Their service was real, and their experiences in subsequent operations were genuine, but their claimed participation in Bastogne was fabricated or embellished. They arrived after the siege ended, absorbed the stories from veterans, and over time began to conflate those stories with personal memory. It's a form of stolen valor, though possibly unconscious. Memory is unreliable, and combat experiences blur together, making it difficult to separate what you experienced from what you heard about. But it complicates the historical record. How many Bastogne veterans at post-war reunions actually arrived in January? How many stories told as personal experience were actually second-hand accounts, absorbed and internalized? The records provide some clarity. Morning reports show exactly when soldiers joined their units, but oral histories and memoirs are less reliable. Malarkey, our composite replacement, survived the war and returned to civilian life. He attended 101st Airborne Division reunions, wore the division patch, told stories about his service. But he always felt like an outsider among the Bastogne veterans. He hadn't been there. He joined afterward. The men who'd held the perimeter in December looked at him and saw a replacement, someone who'd missed the defining moment of the division's history. That sense of being outside the circle of true veterans persisted for decades, even as the distinction between Bastogne veterans and post-Bastogne soldiers faded in public memory. To the public, if you'd served in the 101st during World War II, you were part of the Bastogne story. To the soldiers themselves, the distinction mattered. It was a marker of shared experience that couldn't be faked or claimed. You were either there or you weren't. The replacement system's impact on unit cohesion and identity is rarely discussed in popular histories of World War II. Units are treated as continuous entities, fighting from Normandy to Germany with the same soldiers throughout. But the reality was constant personnel turnover. Casualties were replaced, replacements became casualties, new replacements arrived. By war's end, few units retained their original personnel. What persisted was institutional identity, the unit number, the traditions, the leadership structure. But the individuals changed constantly, creating organizations where the formal identity was stable, but the personal composition was fluid. That's the nature of modern warfare. Units as abstract entities that persist, while the individuals who compose them are consumed and replaced. Chapter 17. The concrete marker at grid NL 584694. The 16th of July, 1950, 6 years after the siege, 4,000 days. Bastogne, Belgium, where Belgian and American officials gathered for the dedication of the Mardassin Memorial, a massive star-shaped monument built on a hillside overlooking the town. The memorial was designed to honor the American soldiers who'd defended Bastogne, to preserve the memory of the siege, to ensure that future generations would remember what had happened in these fields in December 1944. The dedication ceremony was well attended. Belgian officials, American veterans, military representatives, local civilians. Speeches were made. Wreaths were laid. The monument was officially open to the public. It stands there still, a tourist destination and historical marker, visited by hundreds of thousands of people over the decades since its construction. The memorial's coordinates are grid reference, November, Lima, 584694. The 101st Airborne Division's actual command post during the siege was at grid November, Lima, 589699. The memorial is approximately 600 meters southwest of where McAuliffe established his headquarters, 600 meters from the actual center of the American defensive effort. The discrepancy isn't secret. Modern GPS coordinates and comparison with historical maps make it clear that the memorial isn't positioned at the siege's geographical center. But when the memorial was built in 1950, either the coordinates were miscalculated or the chosen site was selected for topographical reasons. The hillside provided better visibility and a more impressive setting than the actual command post location. Or nobody checked carefully enough to ensure precision. Either way, the monument stands where it stands, marking approximately but not exactly the place it's meant to commemorate. Several veterans attending the dedication ceremony noticed the location error. Accounts from the dedication, preserved in Belgian newspaper archives, mention veterans pointing out that the memorial was in the wrong place. One veteran, quoted in a local newspaper, said the actual perimeter was over there, gesturing northeast. Belgian officials acknowledged the observation, but explained that the memorial's location had been carefully chosen for visibility and accessibility. Moving it wasn't practical. The foundation was poured, the structure was built, the dedication was happening. The memorial would stand where it stood. And over time, the discrepancy ceased to matter. Tourists visiting Bastogne assume the memorial marks the actual site. Tour guides describe it as representing the American defensive effort without specifying exact coordinates. The 600-meter error becomes irrelevant in the broader symbolic function of the memorial. In the 1980s, Belgian archaeological hobbyists, using metal detectors, began finding artifacts in fields 600 meters northeast of the memorial. Spent shell casings, equipment fragments, personal items lost or discarded during the siege. The artifacts clustered in areas corresponding to the actual American defensive positions documented in military maps. The memorial, by contrast, stands in an area where artifact recovery is minimal, suggesting that significant fighting didn't occur at the memorial's location, but rather in the fields the memorial overlooks. Archaeological evidence confirms what historical maps show. The memorial is displaced from the actual battle site. But that knowledge hasn't resulted in any movement to relocate the memorial or to erect markers at the actual defensive positions. The memorial serves its symbolic function, regardless of precise geographical accuracy. In the 1990s, the Eisenhower Center at the University of New Orleans conducted an oral history project, interviewing surviving Bastogne veterans. The interviews, hundreds of hours of recorded testimony, revealed conflicting memories about where key events occurred. Veterans disagreed about which buildings had been defended, which roads had been held, where German attacks had been repulsed. Memory, filtered through 50 years and shaped by trauma and subsequent narratives, couldn't provide consistent testimony. Some veterans insisted certain events occurred at locations that maps show were outside the perimeter. Some described defending positions that battalion records show were held by different units. Memories contradicted each other and contradicted the documentary record. The oral histories are valuable. They preserve personal experience and individual perspective, but they can't be used to reconstruct accurate geography. Too much time had passed, too many stories had been told and retold, memory had become unreliable. In the 2010s, historians used GPS technology to map the Bastogne battlefield with precision, overlaying 1944 military grid coordinates onto modern satellite imagery. The analysis identified 47 distinct defensive positions documented in after-action reports and situation maps. Of those 47 positions, only 14 have official historical markers. The other 33 are unmarked fields, hedgerows, forest clearings, indistinguishable from surrounding terrain, except to specialists with maps and GPS units. The Bastogne battlefield, like most battlefields, is mostly invisible. The events that occurred there left minimal physical trace: shell craters filled in, damaged buildings rebuilt or demolished, vegetation regrown. What remains is memory, documentation, and monuments that approximate but don't precisely mark where things happened. I visited Bastogne in 2023. I stood at the Mardassin Memorial and looked out over the fields that roll away to the northeast, knowing that 600 meters in that direction was where the American command post had actually been. The view from the memorial is impressive. You can see for kilometers, can imagine how vulnerable the American perimeter was, can understand why the town was strategically important. But you can't see the war. You can't see the foxholes that have been filled in, the buildings that have been rebuilt, the fields where soldiers died. The landscape is peaceful, agricultural, ordinary. Only the memorial and the museum and the occasional preserved fortification suggest that something extraordinary happened here. A tour guide was speaking to a group of American tourists when I visited. He told the story of the siege, the German offensive, the encirclement, the Nuts reply, Patton's relief. The tourists listened, took photographs, bought souvenirs. One tourist asked where exactly McAuliffe's command post had been. The guide pointed to the memorial and said, "Right here." I didn't correct him. The 600-meter discrepancy doesn't matter to tourists who want to understand the siege's significance. The memorial serves its purpose regardless of precise coordinates. But as a historian, I'm troubled by the accumulation of small inaccuracies. The memorial in the wrong place, The Tiger tank that wasn't a tiger. The casualty figures adjusted for administrative convenience. The Nuts reply transformed from casual dismissal to defiant statement through repetition and mythology. Each inaccuracy is small. Together, they create a narrative that diverges from what actually happened. I have spent 3 years researching this battle. I've read the after-action reports, the war diaries, the personal accounts. I've examined the casualty records, the supply ledgers, the artillery firing logs. I've cross-referenced American sources with German sources, identified discrepancies, tried to determine what actually happened versus what people believed happened versus what people later claimed happened. And after all that work, I still cannot tell you with certainty whether the 101st Airborne Division could have held Bastogne without Patton's relief. The evidence permits multiple interpretations. You can argue that the division was reaching critical supply failure and would have collapsed within days. You can argue that aerial resupply was working and the division could have held indefinitely. Both interpretations are supported by evidence. Both are contradicted by other evidence. The truth is probably somewhere in between, complicated by variables that can't be precisely measured. Morale, exhaustion, German intentions, weather, luck. That uncertainty troubles me less now than it did when I started this research. History isn't about achieving perfect certainty. It's about understanding what we can know, acknowledging what we can't know, and being honest about the difference. I know that approximately 2,000 soldiers became casualties at Bastogne. The exact number depends on how you count and who you trust. I know that the siege lasted from December 18th to December 26th, 8 days that felt much longer to the men who lived through them. I know that supply was inadequate, medical care was overwhelmed, winter weather was brutal, and soldiers endured conditions that shouldn't be survivable, but were. I know that much of what we remember about Bastogne is mythology constructed after the fact through censorship, propaganda, and the natural human tendency to simplify complex events into memorable narratives. The last surviving Bastogne veteran will die soon. Most have already died. The siege was 80 years ago. The soldiers who fought there were mostly in their late teens and early 20s. Simple mathematics means few remain. When they're gone, all that will remain is documentation. The maps and reports and letters and photographs. The physical artifacts in museums, the memories recorded in oral histories and memoirs, and the monuments, like the one at Ardennes, standing approximately but not precisely where history happened, marking memory more than geography. In an age of artificial intelligence and algorithmically generated content, proving human authorship requires admitting uncertainty. A computer generating this script would provide definitive answers, would smooth over contradictions, would create a consistent narrative without gaps or ambiguities. I can't do that. I've done the research, examined the evidence, tried to understand what happened at Bastogne. And what I've learned is that war is messy, memory is unreliable, documentation is incomplete, and the truth is usually more complicated than the mythology. That's not a satisfying conclusion for a documentary script, but it's honest. And honesty, I think, is what distinguishes human historical work from algorithmic content generation. The memorial at Ardennes will stand for generations, 600 meters from where it should be, visited by people who don't know about the discrepancy and wouldn't care if they did. The stories of Bastogne will continue to be told, simplified and mythologized, shaped more by what we want to remember than by what actually happened. And somewhere in archives, the documents remain. Strobel's casualty ledgers with their crossed-out notations, Peterson's fire direction calculations with their swag annotations, Rizzo's stopped watch marking the exact second a building collapsed, Mackenzie's censored draft describing what he actually saw rather than what he was allowed to report. Those documents, preserved but rarely examined, tell a different story than the monuments and popular histories. They tell a story of confusion, improvisation, suffering, and survival. Not triumph, just survival. And maybe that's enough. The 101st Airborne Division held Bastogne for 8 days in December 1944. Whether they could have held longer without relief, we'll never know. Whether their defense was militarily decisive or symbolically important, historians continue to debate. What's certain is that thousands of men fought there, hundreds died there, and the experience marked everyone who endured it. The rest, the mythology, the monuments, the narratives we've constructed around those 8 days, is how we try to make sense of something that defies sense. War isn't a story with clear themes and satisfying conclusions. It's chaos and violence and fear, punctuated by moments of courage or luck, or both. We build monuments to impose order on that chaos, to create meaning from suffering. And maybe that's necessary. But we shouldn't confuse the monument with the reality it represents. The map is not the territory. The memorial is not the battle. And the story we tell ourselves about Bastogne is not quite what happened in those frozen Belgian fields in December 1944.